Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The rain fell in heavy, steady sheets as the old lodge appeared through the mist, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening trees. The distant sound of thunder rumbled like a warning, yet there was something oddly inviting about the flickering lights within. A group of travelers had found their way to this forgotten part of the world, the road to the lodge barely visible, swallowed by the overgrown forest. As they approached, the smell of wet earth and pine mixed with a faint scent of burning wood. The air felt thick, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The travelers gathered around the campfire near the lodge's entrance, the crackling of the flames cutting through the silence. One of them, a man named Jake, looked up at the trees, feeling a strange unease crawling along his spine. He couldn't explain why, but something about the forest felt off. The way the branches twisted like skeletal hands, reaching for something just out of sight, or the eerie rustle in the leaves that didn't seem quite right. Inside the lodge, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the cold, wet world outside. They had hoped for a night of rest, but the air in the lodge was heavy, filled with an unspoken tension. It was as if the walls themselves whispered of things long past, things that shouldn't be remembered. Jake felt a chill as he gazed into the flickering campfire, the shadows of the trees dancing on the walls of the lodge, as if the forest itself was waiting. The rain began to pound harder against the roof, the sound almost deafening, and yet, in the silence that followed, he could hear something else. A low, distant thump. A thump that seemed to come from deep within the forest. The distant thump echoed through the rain-soaked woods, its rhythm unsettling and unnaturally slow. The flames in the campfire flickered, casting long, twisted shadows against the lodge's stone walls. The sound of the rain, which had once been a soothing backdrop, now felt like an ominous symphony, drowning out everything except that low, persistent thud. Jake shifted uneasily in his seat by the fire, glancing around at the others. There were 4 of them in total. Him, a woman named Claire, a quiet man named Daniel, and Ellie, who seemed more at home in the forest than any of them. She had insisted on taking the hike through the woods, even when they were warned that the lodge had been abandoned for years. Now, her face was pale, eyes wide as she stared into the darkness beyond the flickering campfire. "Did anyone else hear that?" Jake finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Claire, who had been nervously fidgeting with her jacket, nodded. "Yeah, I heard it too. I thought it was just the wind or a tree falling, but that didn't sound like either of those." Ellie was the first to rise from her seat, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "It's not the wind," she said, her voice low and steady. "That sound, it's too deliberate. It's coming from the woods." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Are we really going out there? In this weather?" Ellie's gaze sharpened, her fingers drumming against the wooden table. "We need to find out what it is. It's probably just an animal, but if it's something else..." Her words trailed off, leaving a sense of unease hanging in the air. The fire crackled loudly, almost like a warning, but the group was already on their feet, moving toward the door. As they stepped outside, the heavy rain welcomed them, soaking them instantly. The mist had thickened, swirling around the trees in a ghostly dance, and the air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and something else, something faint but unmistakable. Ellie led the way, her eyes scanning the darkness. "It came from that way," she said, pointing toward a dense cluster of trees where the rain seemed to fall harder, almost as if the woods themselves were absorbing the sound of the storm. As they trudged deeper into the forest, the thumps grew louder, clearer. It was rhythmic, deliberate. A beat that seemed almost too human in its cadence. A soft, chilling tapping sound. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and creaking under the weight of the storm. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as they ventured further, away from the safety of the lodge and the warmth of the fire. With each step, the sounds of the forest grew more intense, the rain louder, the wind sharper. Yet there was something else, a tension in the air, a growing sense of being watched. Suddenly, Ellie stopped in her tracks. The thumping was gone. The forest fell silent. For a long, breathless moment, they stood there, waiting for something to break the stillness. But there was nothing, only the sound of rain pattering against the leaves and the distant crackle of thunder. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something move. A shape. A shadow that wasn't part of the storm. It shifted between the trees, just beyond the reach of their lantern light. Too large to be an animal, too quick to be a person. Jake's heart raced. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. Ellie's eyes darted to the spot where he had seen the movement. Stay close, she said, her voice suddenly tight with urgency. But it was already too late. From behind them, a cold breeze swept through the trees and a voice, low, hollow, and full of malice, whispered through the rain-soaked air. Leave, before it's too late. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It didn't sound human, but it was unmistakably real. It sent a chill down their spines, and for a moment, none of them moved. They were frozen, caught between the fear of the unknown and the strange pull to discover more. Ellie was the first to break the silence. She turned to the others, her face pale. We need to go back. Now. But as they turned to retrace their steps, the path that had seemed so clear before was gone. The trees had shifted, the fog had thickened, and the forest seemed to close in on them. The lodge was no longer visible through the mist. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Panic crept into Jake's chest as he turned in circles, searching for the familiar flicker of the lodge's lights. The trees around them had grown impossibly dense, their branches intertwining like twisted fingers, blocking out the sky and trapping them in an endless sea of dark, shifting shadows. We're lost, Claire murmured, her voice barely audible above the rain. Her eyes were wide, her breath quickening as she glanced over her shoulder, as though she could feel something following them in the dark. We need to get back to the lodge. Ellie's hand shot out to stop her. The lodge isn't where we left it, she said, her voice grim. The forest doesn't work like that. Jake felt a chill settle into his bones. Ellie's words rang with an eerie certainty, as if she knew something they didn't. Something about the forest had changed the moment they stepped off the path. It wasn't just the storm or the mist. It was as if the forest itself had shifted, pulling them deeper into its depths. We need to stay calm, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the growing unease. We'll find the lodge again. It can't have just disappeared. But Jake knew better. The unease that had gnawed at him since they first arrived at the lodge had blossomed into full-blown fear. Every rustle of the trees, every creak of the branches above them, sounded like something more than just wind. He felt as though the forest was breathing, exhaling against his skin, waiting for them to make a wrong move. A crackle from behind them cut through the tension like a knife. Stay close, Ellie ordered, her tone sharp, almost commanding. She didn't wait for a response, stepping forward with purpose, her eyes scanning the forest ahead, the rain pattering against her hood. The thumping had returned, soft at first, then louder. Steady. Rhythmic. It was different now, as if it were moving toward them, growing nearer with each passing second. What is that? Claire whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed Jake's sleeve, pulling him closer, her fear palpable. I don't know, Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted around, scanning the trees. The sound was unmistakable. Something was out there, moving just beyond the reach of their lanterns. Something that had been waiting for them. The thumping stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was nothing but the deafening sound of rain, the occasional creak of the trees, and the distant rumble of thunder. It felt wrong. All of it. Then, without warning, the voice returned. Leave now. The whisper was softer this time, almost like a breath in the wind. But it was there, clear as day. And it was close. Jake froze. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere around them had changed. Ellie's hand shot out to grab his arm, her grip tight and urgent. We need to go, she said, her voice strained, before it's too late. The others didn't need to be told twice. In a panic, they turned, stumbling back the way they came. But the forest had changed. What had once been a clear path was now an endless maze of towering trees, their branches knotted and twisted like fingers stretching out to trap them. The dense fog closed in around them, swallowing the light from their lantern, making the world feel small and oppressive. They ran, or at least they tried to. But the rain had made the ground slick, the forest floor muddy and treacherous. Every step seemed to take them deeper into the woods. The trees were no longer silent spectators. The wind howled around them, and the rain whipped at their faces like icy needles. It was as though the forest was alive, its roots reaching out to pull them down into the earth. Jake stumbled, his foot slipping in the mud. As he reached for a nearby tree to steady himself, a low growl reverberated from the shadows. It was so deep, so guttural, that it vibrated in his chest. The growl was followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving swiftly through the underbrush. I think we're not alone, Jake gasped, panic rising in his throat. He looked back over his shoulder, but the fog swallowed everything behind them. There was no sign of whatever had made the noise. Ellie's eyes darted around, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. It's not an animal. I can feel it, she said, her voice trembling with fear. Claire's face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror. What do we do? We keep moving, Ellie said, her voice steadier now, though it was clear she was just as scared. We get to the lodge. We don't stop. But as they pushed forward, the path twisted again, the trees growing denser, the air heavier. They had gone in a straight line, hadn't they? How could they have gone in circles? And then, just as they were about to lose hope, they saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, dark, and impossibly still. A shape that shouldn't have been there. Its face was obscured by shadows, but the feeling of dread it exuded was undeniable. It watched them, unmoving as the wind howled through the trees. "Don't look away," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. But it was too late. The figure stepped forward, moving with unnatural speed, the fog swirling around it like a shroud. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them gave way. They fell into the darkness. The world around them plunged into chaos as the ground gave way. The earth seemed to collapse beneath their feet, pulling them down into the blackness of the unknown. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and wet leaves, and the sound of the forest above them grew muffled, replaced by the deafening rush of wind and the eerie silence that swallowed them whole. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as he tumbled through the darkness, his limbs flailing to grasp onto anything that could stop his fall. The world spun in dizzying circles, each moment feeling like an eternity. He could hear the others' cries, their voices distorted and distant, but they were lost in the chaos of their descent. Then, with a jarring thud, everything stopped. For a moment there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just an overwhelming stillness. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching from the fall. His eyes blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the darkness, but it was like a suffocating void around him. "Is everyone okay?" Jake's voice trembled, but it was enough to break the silence. "Yeah." Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "I think so." Ellie groaned from somewhere nearby. "What the hell just happened?" Her voice was filled with a mix of fear and frustration. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice tight with dread. "But I don't think we're not in the same place anymore." The air was colder now, and the earthy smell that had once been so familiar had changed. There was something wrong with it, something sharp and metallic that made Jake's skin crawl. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dark, the faint outline of figures becoming clearer as they all struggled to sit up. They were underground. The floor beneath them was uneven, made of cold stone, and the walls surrounding them were damp and slick with moisture. The tunnel seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction, the air stagnant, thick with mildew and rot. The feeling of claustrophobia was immediate, the space closing in on them as they realized just how deep they had fallen. "Where are we?" Daniel asked, his voice strained as he pushed himself up from the ground. He sounded smaller now, more vulnerable, as if the very air had drained the strength from him. "I don't know," Ellie muttered. "But I don't like it. This doesn't feel like an accident. I think it's been waiting for us." The tunnel around them seemed to echo her words, the walls vibrating with an unseen force. It was as though the earth itself was alive, watching them. The air grew heavier, the sense of being trapped deepened. Jake could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere far off in the distance, the drops echoing through the vast underground space. "Stay close," Ellie said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to find a way out of here." The group stood in silence for a moment, unsure of where to go. There were no paths, no clear direction. Just the oppressive darkness and the damp, suffocating air. It was like being swallowed whole by the earth. The faintest sound broke the stillness. A creak. A slow, deliberate groan of something ancient. Jake's eyes snapped to the source of the sound, his pulse quickening. From deep within the shadows of the tunnel ahead, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the stone walls. It wasn't the sound of an animal, not like anything they had heard before. It was deeper, older, more primal. It vibrated through the ground beneath them, sending a shiver through their bodies. "We need to move. Now," Ellie said, her voice trembling slightly. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the dark ahead, her movements sharp and cautious. The others hesitated but followed her lead, the fear of the unknown outweighing any sense of safety in the darkness behind them. They moved in single file, trying to stay close to each other, their footsteps echoing loudly in the tunnel. The growling was growing louder now, each rumble vibrating through the ground and into their bones. It was closer. And with each passing moment, Jake could feel the pull of something dark and ancient, a presence in the deep that seemed to be waking, stretching, preparing to rise. The walls of the tunnel began to close in, narrowing as they walked. What had been a wide, open passage was now a claustrophobic crawlspace, the stones scraping against their shoulders as they pushed forward. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though it was becoming more difficult to breathe. "We're not alone down here," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. Something's down here with us." Jake didn't need to say anything. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the growl echoed again, closer now, unmistakably close. Then just ahead, a faint glow appeared in the distance. A light, weak but steady, flickering like a candle. Ellie's pace quickened, her eyes locked on the light. "There's something ahead. We need to get there fast." They pushed forward, their footsteps quickening, the growling now replaced by an unsettling silence, the sound of their own breathing and the distant echo of water dripping the only things filling the tunnel. As they drew closer to the light, the shape of what lay ahead began to emerge from the darkness. It was a door. An old wooden door, its edges warped and cracked as though it had been here for centuries. But there was something wrong with it. The door wasn't just worn, it was wrong. The wood was slick with something dark and wet, and the faintest outline of symbols, strange ancient runes, etched into its surface caught the faint light. Ellie stopped just short of the door, her eyes narrowed in disbelief. Whatever's on the other side of that door, we're not ready for it. But it was too late. The growl was back. It was louder now, almost deafening. The ground shook beneath them, and before they could react, the door creaked open by itself. The darkness beyond it beckoned them, promising answers, or perhaps something far worse. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing nothing but inky blackness beyond its frame. The faint, sickly glow of their lanterns barely penetrated the deep void, making it impossible to see what lay on the other side. The air felt heavier here, thicker, as though the very fabric of reality itself had grown brittle. The growling had stopped, but a deep, unsettling silence had replaced it, one that crawled under their skin and made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Ellie stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She seemed to be contemplating something, her mind racing, her heart thundering in her chest. But the others, too afraid to speak, knew that the choice before them was simple. There was no going back. The dark had already claimed them. The only way forward was through the door. "Ellie," Claire whispered, her voice trembling, "what is this place? What are we walking into?" Ellie didn't answer right away. She was scanning the dark beyond the door, as though trying to decipher the meaning of what she was seeing, or perhaps sensing. Her hand, clenched tightly around the lantern, shook slightly. "Stay close," she finally said, her voice tight with resolve. "Whatever this is, we're in it together. No one gets left behind." With that, she took the first step, crossing the threshold into the unknown. The others followed, their hearts pounding in their chests, as though each step took them closer to something ancient and unknowable. The ground beyond the door was uneven, the stones slick and treacherous beneath their feet. They moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the dead silence that surrounded them. The lanterns flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls, which seemed to pulse and shift in the dim light. The air here was unlike anything they had felt before. It was colder, yes, but there was something else, something more insidious. A faint smell lingered in the air, metallic and rancid, like blood that had been left to rot. It made Jake's stomach churn, but he forced himself to swallow the bile rising in his throat. Ellie led the way, her gaze never leaving the path ahead, the lantern held high. Her steps were deliberate, each one calculated, as if she knew exactly where she was going. And yet, none of them had any idea what lay ahead. The walls around them began to change as they moved deeper into the space. The stone, once rough and jagged, began to smooth out, becoming unervingly perfect, as though it had been carved by something or someone. Symbols, strange and cryptic, appeared on the walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. Some were ancient, others newer, as if they had been etched more recently just for them. "What is this place?" Daniel asked again, his voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes darted from one wall to the next, the fear in his voice now unmistakable. "This isn't natural," Ellie muttered. "None of this is." They continued forward, the path narrowing as the tunnel seemed to collapse around them. The walls were getting closer now, their smooth surface reflecting the dim light of the lantern. Jake could feel the oppressive weight of the space closing in on them, as though the walls were slowly inching inward, preparing to trap them for good. Then, ahead, there was something else. A massive chamber, the size of a cathedral, opened up before them. It was impossibly vast, the ceiling lost in darkness, too high to see. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and what appeared to be old, dried leaves. The air felt even colder here, and the ground beneath their feet shifted slightly, as though something below the surface was moving, restless. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, ancient and covered in strange markings. It was surrounded by a ring of tall, twisted pillars, each one etched with the same symbols they had seen on the walls. The air in the chamber seemed to hum with a low frequency, like the faint vibration of a distant voice. Jake's stomach lurched as he looked around, realizing something. They were not alone. At first, it was just a feeling, an unshakable sense that there was something watching them. But as they stepped further into the chamber, the shadows seemed to move. Twisting, bending, shifting in ways that were impossible for their eyes to comprehend. The air grew colder, and the faint hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones. Then, from the corners of the chamber, figures began to emerge. At first, they were just shadows, vague outlines in the dark, but then they solidified into shapes. Tall, emaciated figures with skin stretched tight over their bones, their eyes dark and hollow. Their bodies were covered in tattered, ancient robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods that cast their features in shadow. Jake's heart slammed in his chest. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie stepped forward, her gaze locked on the figures. "They're guardians," she whispered, though the word seemed strange in her mouth, as though she had spoken it reluctantly. "They've been waiting for us." The figures didn't move at first, standing still as if bound by some ancient, unseen force. The tension in the air was unbearable. Jake could feel his breath growing shallow, his pulse quickening as his eyes darted from one figure to the next. The guardians seemed to be aware of their presence, but they made no move to approach. Then, as if on cue, the low hum in the air stopped, and a voice, cold and deep, resonated through the chamber. "You have come," it said, though there was no sign of who had spoken. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the walls, echoing in their minds. "You should not have come." The temperature in the room dropped drastically, the air turning icy. The figures began to move then, slowly at first, like marionettes jerked by invisible strings. Their footsteps were soft, the sound of dry bones creaking in the silence, but there was a disturbing precision to their movements. Jake felt the pull of something ancient, something dark and powerful emanating from the altar, drawing them closer, like moths to a flame. "You must leave," the voice continued, its tone now tinged with anger, "before the awakening begins." The guardian's eyes, dark, hollow pits, fixed on them, and Jake felt a wave of dread wash over him. Something was about to happen. Something terrible. And it was already too late to turn back. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread as the voice echoed through the chamber, sending cold shivers down their spines. The guardians, those tall, emaciated figures, moved closer, their hollow eyes never leaving the group. Their presence felt suffocating, their very existence bending the air around them, making it feel heavier. Each step they took reverberated in the chamber like the sound of death itself. "We can't leave," Ellie whispered, though the words seemed to come from somewhere far away. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes locked on the altar. The guardians didn't move to stop her, but their gaze sharpened, their hollow eyes glistening in the dim light. Jake wanted to scream, to tell them all to run, but the words stuck in his throat. There was something about this place, a force, a pull, that made his mind grow foggy, his thoughts slow and sluggish. His legs felt heavy, like he was being drawn deeper into the center of the chamber, toward the altar that stood ominously before them. The altar was the focal point of the room. Its stone surface was covered in thick layers of dust, but the carvings etched into it were intricate, beautiful, and somehow wrong. The symbols on the altar mirrored those on the walls, ancient, cryptic, with a language that seemed to twist the very air around them as if they were speaking in a tongue that should never have been heard. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, and the low hum had returned, vibrating through the stones like a forgotten heartbeat. It was a pulse, an ancient rhythm, the sound of something old awakening from a long slumber. Something dangerous. Ellie's eyes flickered over to the figures, her face pale, and for the first time, Jake saw fear in her expression. This was not the fearless guide they had followed into the woods. No, this was someone who understood the stakes, the ancient power that slumbered beneath their feet. And she had no intention of awakening it. "Ellie, what is this place?" Claire's voice cracked, the fear palpable. She clung to Jake, her grip tight, as though seeking some measure of comfort in the chaos. "Why are those things here? What are they guarding?" Ellie took a slow breath, her voice trembling but resolute. "The altar," she said, "is a seal. It's been holding something back. But that seal is weakening. And we've already triggered it." Jake felt a cold rush of fear flood through him. He glanced at the altar again, and this time he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The stone was cracked, a deep fissure running down the center, as though the altar itself was beginning to break apart. Something inside it was stirring. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the silence, followed by a low rumbling sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath them. The ground trembled, a violent shake that sent the group reeling. The lanterns flickered violently, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch out like dark fingers across the walls. The guardians took a step forward, their movements deliberate and slow, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The symbols etched into their robes, runes similar to those on the altar, began to glow, faint at first but growing brighter by the second. Jake's heart raced. What is happening? Ellie's voice was barely a whisper. The awakening. It's starting. Before anyone could react, the fissure in the altar expanded, splitting wide open with a deafening crack. The very air around them seemed to thicken, to swell, as if the space itself was being torn apart. A dark, swirling mist began to pour out from the crack, its tendrils curling and twisting in the air like living smoke. The chamber was filled with the sound of something ancient and alien, a deep, resonating growl that vibrated through their chests. Jake couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could feel was the overwhelming presence of something far older and far more powerful than anything he had ever known. From the darkness of the mist, a figure began to emerge. It was not human. Not entirely. A form like a shadow but enormous, towering above them. Its shape was humanoid, but its features were distorted and nightmarish, shifting as though they couldn't hold a form for long. Its eyes were endless black voids, filled with an emptiness that seemed to consume the very light around them. The guardians fell to their knees as the figure fully emerged, their heads bowed in reverence. It was as if they were acknowledging its return, welcoming the entity back into this world. This, Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. This is what the seal was meant to keep locked away. The figure's presence was overwhelming. The air grew cold, suffocatingly cold, and Jake could feel his heart struggling to beat, his breath growing shallow as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The ground trembled with each step the creature took, its shape shifting, almost undulating like smoke. Is it alive? Claire gasped, her voice barely a whisper. It's more than alive, Ellie replied, her voice distant, as if lost in a memory she couldn't escape. It's a thing of the old world, a force that existed before time itself. It was imprisoned here, until now. The figure raised one arm, a movement so slow and deliberate that it felt like the entire world held its breath. From within the mist, a voice rang out, a voice that didn't come from any lips, but from everywhere at once. It was deep, guttural, like the sound of 100 voices speaking in unison. You have awakened me, the voice said, its tone cold, ancient, and filled with power. Now you will serve. The words echoed in the chamber, vibrating the very bones of their bodies. The guardians rose to their feet, their eyes fixed on the creature, their bodies stiff with reverence. No, Ellie whispered, stepping back. It can't. But it was too late. The creature's form surged forward, its tendrils of mist curling around them, its presence choking the air from their lungs. Jake gasped, his vision blurring, his body trembling under the weight of its power. Run, Ellie choked out, her voice barely audible over the roaring hum that filled the chamber. Run, now. But there was no escape. The ground shook violently, the walls of the chamber cracking apart. The mist swirled faster and faster, and with a sickening crack, the altar shattered, sending stone fragments flying into the air. The guardians howled in pain, their bodies contorting as the creature's influence spread through the chamber, like an infection. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything went black. The world around them went silent. A complete and utter stillness that swallowed the chaos, the screams, and the crushing force of the creature's presence. It felt as though time itself had stopped, leaving only an oppressive blackness that hung in the air like a dense fog, thick with an unnatural weight. Jake blinked, but the darkness remained. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat sending waves of cold terror through his limbs. His breath came in ragged gasps, but the air was thick, almost suffocating, making it difficult to breathe. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, nothing but the quiet echo of his own terrified thoughts. It felt like he was trapped in a void, surrounded by nothingness. But then, slowly, the world began to return, like a faded painting being brought into focus. His vision cleared, and he could make out the dim outlines of the others, standing motionless, their faces contorted in horror. What happened? Claire whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out, her hand brushing against Jake's arm. She sounded as though she were speaking through water, her words distorted, distant. I don't know, Jake muttered, his voice hoarse. What was that thing? Ellie was the first to speak, her tone broken and filled with dread. We shouldn't have come here. We awakened something ancient, something that was never meant to return. And now? Her words faltered as she looked around, her eyes scanning the chamber as if expecting the creature to reappear at any moment. The stone walls that had once seemed solid were now cracked, fissures snaking across the surface like a web. The air felt electric, charged with something dark, a pulse that resonated through every stone in the chamber, every breath they took. Suddenly, a low hum began to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet, like the deep growl of an animal stirring from sleep. It was the same frequency they had felt earlier, only this time it was stronger, louder. It reverberated in their chests, a constant low pressure building in the atmosphere, pressing against their lungs, their minds. What's happening? Daniel gasped, his eyes wide with panic. Why can't I breathe? Ellie's face went pale, her expression distant as she strained to listen, her eyes narrowing. It's the mist, she said, barely audible. It's not just air. It's something else. It's getting into us. We need to get out. Now. But the path behind them was gone. The door that had once stood at the edge of the chamber, the doorway they had come through, was no longer there. In its place, a solid wall of stone had risen, smooth and impenetrable, as if it had never existed. No. No, no. Claire cried out, her voice rising in panic. We're trapped. We can't leave. The chamber began to shift, the floor beneath their feet trembling violently, and a sickening, wet sound filled the air, like the scraping of bone on stone. Jake stumbled back, his eyes wide in horror as the walls of the chamber began to move. Not physically, but in a way that defied logic. The stone seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. And then, from the far corner of the room, another presence emerged. It was a shape, a human shape, but distorted, twisted. It was the same figure from before, the one they had seen in the mist, towering over them like a shadow. The creature's form flickered in and out of focus, as though it couldn't hold its shape. Its features were more defined now. Its eyes, those black voids, gleamed with an unnatural light, and its body seemed to ripple with darkness, its presence warping the very space around it. But this time it wasn't alone. From the shadows around the room, more figures began to materialize. They were different, yet familiar, the guardians. But they were no longer the same twisted figures that had bowed to the creature. No, now they were something worse. Their bodies were contorted, their faces twisted in silent agony, their eyes hollow, their limbs unnaturally elongated. They moved without grace, stumbling as if they were puppets whose strings had been tangled beyond recognition. The symbols on their bodies glowed faintly, but there was no reverence in their movements anymore. They were something else now, agents of the creature bent to its will. The creature's form loomed larger, its presence growing as it stepped forward, its dark mist swirling around it like a shroud. Its voice was a deep, guttural growl, a sound that made the very air crackle with dark energy. You have disturbed my slumber, it rumbled, the voice coming from all around them, filling the chamber. And for that you will pay the price. The mist around the creature pulsed, and suddenly the guardians, those twisted, tortured souls, lunged forward, their skeletal hands reaching for them. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, but fast, too fast. Their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and they screeched, their voices nothing more than hollow whispers of agony. The group scattered, but the chamber seemed to shift with them, the stone walls moving like liquid, making escape impossible. Ellie grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward a narrow crevice in the wall, just as one of the guardians reached for Claire. No! Jake shouted, but Ellie yanked him forward with all her strength. We can't help them. We have to get out now. They squeezed through the crevice, the stone digging into their skin as they slipped through the tight opening. On the other side they found themselves in a narrow, twisting tunnel, the walls slick with moisture, the air even thicker than before. The ground beneath them shook, but they kept running. The echoes of the guardian's screams and the creature's low, rumbling growl filled the tunnel, driving them forward. Ellie's voice broke the silence between them. We have to find a way out of here. It's not just the creature. The forest, everything, has been changed. We're inside its heart now. If we don't escape, we'll be consumed. What do we do? Claire gasped, her voice cracking. We keep going, Ellie said, her voice trembling but resolute. We keep going until we find the light. The walls of the tunnel seemed to pulse, as if responding to her words. The darkness ahead stretched out like an endless void, and the distant, blood-curdling growls of the guardians reminded them that there was no safety here. Not anymore. They had awakened something far worse than they had ever imagined. And now, the forest itself was alive, pulling them deeper into its ancient, malevolent heart. The tunnel seemed endless. Each step felt heavier, the walls narrowing as though the very earth itself was closing in on them. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air was thick with an oppressive, damp chill. Every time Jake took a breath, the air tasted foul, like old rot, like something that had been buried for far too long. His heart was racing in his chest, his mind spinning with the events of the last few moments. The creature, the guardians, the chamber, it was all so surreal. It felt like a nightmare, but the fear in his chest told him it was far too real. The sound of the growls, low and rumbling, followed them, echoing down the tunnel like the distant sound of thunder, promising something terrible in its wake. The stone beneath their feet trembled with every footstep, like the ground itself was unsettled by their presence. Ellie led them through the maze-like passage, her pace steady despite the growing fear that hung over them like a dark cloud. Her eyes were focused, her brow furrowed with determination, but there was something in her expression, something haunted, that made Jake nervous. "We're not out of danger yet," Ellie murmured, her voice steady but filled with an underlying urgency. "The creature, it won't stop until we're all dead. And it won't stop with us. It'll consume everything." "What do you mean, consume everything?" Claire's voice was trembling, her eyes darting around the tunnel as if expecting the walls themselves to close in on them. Ellie glanced back at her, her eyes briefly meeting Claire's. "The creature we awoke, it's not just a beast. It's a force of nature, a force that has existed since before the world was formed. It doesn't just devour life. It consumes the land, the trees, the very essence of this place. Once it's free, it will begin to destroy everything. And the worst part? It won't stop until there's nothing left." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air as they pushed forward. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine at the thought of the creature unleashing its full power. They had already seen its destructive potential in the chamber, the way it had warped the guardians, twisting them into something unrecognizable. The path ahead seemed to stretch on, winding deeper into the earth, darker and more oppressive with each step. The flickering light of their lantern cast long shadows on the uneven stone walls, stretching and twisting with each movement. The sound of the creature's growl, low, ominous, and growing closer, seemed to reverberate through the stone, vibrating through their bones. Jake felt the tension building in his chest, the fear suffocating him. They had to get out. But where? The tunnel they were in seemed to have no end, no way out. It felt as though the very forest itself was alive, pulling them deeper into its heart, closing off any chance of escape. And then, just as they were about to turn another corner, the ground beneath them shifted violently, sending them all stumbling. The stone beneath their feet cracked open, and with a sickening screech, the tunnel split apart. "No!" Ellie shouted, grabbing Jake's arm just as the earth began to crumble away beneath them. But it was too late. The ground gave way completely. The world spun once more as they fell, the earth opening up beneath them like a mouth hungry for their souls. Jake's heart leapt into his throat as he tumbled through the air, his body weightless for a split second before crashing down hard onto something soft, but uneven. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs. He gasped for breath, his chest heaving as he struggled to regain his bearings. He pushed himself up, blinking rapidly, trying to see through the thick darkness. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of their lantern. "Everyone okay?" Jake managed to croak, his voice ragged. Claire groaned from somewhere beside him. "I think so, but what just happened?" Ellie's voice was tight with urgency. "We've fallen into the heart of the forest," she said, her words heavy with meaning. "This is the place where the creature draws its power from. We're deep in its domain now." Jake pushed himself to his feet, trying to steady his shaking limbs. The air was thick with dampness, but it felt different here, denser, more oppressive. And there was a strange, unnatural stillness in the air, like the very environment around them was waiting. But waiting for what? Ellie started to move ahead, the faint glow of the lantern casting long shadows on the jagged stone walls. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice low. "We've entered the part of the forest where the creature's power is at its peak. This is where it draws its strength, where it can warp the very fabric of reality itself. If we don't get out, we'll be consumed by it. All of us." Jake followed Ellie, his mind racing. The terror of what lay ahead, the creature, the guardians, the power they had unknowingly unleashed, clung to him like a second skin. But he had no choice but to follow. The others were with him, and if they were to have any chance of survival, they needed to find a way out of this cursed place. As they pressed forward, the tunnel began to open up, widening into a vast, cavernous space. The walls were lined with strange, pulsating crystals, their eerie glow casting a sickly light over the chamber. The air was thick with a heavy mist that seemed to crawl along the ground, moving in unnatural patterns. The center of the cavern held something they hadn't expected. A massive tree, its bark dark and twisted, its branches gnarled like fingers reaching out to grab them. The tree seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, its roots burrowing deep into the earth, intertwining with the very stone itself. The ground around it was covered in a strange, blackened soil, and the air was thick with a nauseating smell like decay and death. This was it, the heart of the forest, and standing before it, beneath its massive shadow, was the creature. It wasn't just a shadow now. It had fully materialized, its form larger than anything Jake had imagined. It towered over them, its body swirling with dark mist, its eyes endless voids that seemed to stare into the very soul. Its presence was suffocating, an oppressive weight that crushed the air from their lungs. And it was smiling. "Welcome," the creature said, its voice deep, 100 voices speaking in unison. "Welcome to my domain. This is where it all ends." The ground trembled as its mist spread, and the blackened soil around the tree began to stir. The roots twitched and something began to emerge from the earth. A shape, something long writhing like a mass of tendrils, slowly rising up from the soil. It was alive and it was hungry. Ellie stepped forward, her eyes locked on the creature. "You can't." But the creature raised one massive, smoky arm, cutting her off. "I can," it rumbled, "and I will." The creature's form swirled and shifted, its mist-like body pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Its dark eyes, those voids that swallowed light, focused on them with an almost eerie awareness. The air around them thickened, and the oppressive weight of its presence made it feel as though the very atmosphere was closing in, suffocating them, pressing against their chests with a force that was almost physical. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the blackened soil around the massive tree began to shift, the roots moving like serpents beneath the earth. From the shifting mass of tendrils and roots, something else began to rise. A shape that was not quite human, not quite anything they had ever seen before. It was tall, its limbs long and slender, covered in the same twisted bark-like texture as the tree. It stood there, motionless, like an extension of the forest itself, waiting for a command. The creature, the thing, spoke again, its voice vibrating the very stone around them. "This is the end of your journey. The forest has claimed you. You have awakened what was never meant to rise again." Ellie stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming fear that clung to every word. "We didn't know. We didn't understand." The creature's laughter was low, rumbling through the air like distant thunder. "It matters not," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You think you can stop me? You think you can reverse what has already begun?" The tendrils around the tree twisted violently, and the air grew colder still, the ground cracking with the force of the creature's power. The tree itself seemed to breathe, its branches shuddering as though it were awakening from a deep, ancient sleep. The roots groaned, rising up from the soil like twisted hands reaching for the sky. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "What does it want?" Jake felt his heart pound in his chest, his body paralyzed with fear. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The chamber was massive, the walls too far away to even contemplate reaching in time. And behind them, the tunnel had disappeared. The way they came was sealed off, as though the forest itself had swallowed it whole. The creature's attention shifted to Claire, its dark eyes narrowing. "It is not what I want," it said, its voice now cold and contemptuous. "It is what you owe me. Your lives are but the beginning of my rebirth. You have awakened me, and for that, you will be the first to feed the forest again." The air around them grew thicker, charged with a malevolent energy that made the hairs on the back of Jake's neck stand on end. The mist that poured from the creature's form seemed to press in from all sides, and with it, the terrible sensation that something was moving, something watching them from the depths of the dark. Ellie's voice cracked with urgency. "We have to destroy the tree. The tree is the source. If we can destroy it, we can weaken the creature, maybe even banish it back into the earth." Jake turned to her, desperation flooding his chest. "How do we destroy it?" His voice was shaky, the hopelessness of their situation settling over him like a heavy fog. Ellie's eyes flicked to the roots that were slowly creeping toward them, coiling around the stone floor like snakes. "We have to sever the heart of it, the core. The thing at the center of the tree." Her eyes darkened, her lips pressed into a grim line. "But we can't do it alone. She turned to the others, her gaze sharp. "We'll have to make a sacrifice." Claire recoiled, her face contorted in fear. "What kind of sacrifice?" Ellie didn't answer at first. Instead, she took a step toward the tree, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the air near its massive trunk. The moment her fingers brushed the mist, a sharp, resonating hum filled the air, like the sound of 1,000 voices crying out in pain. The mist swirled violently around her, and Jake could feel the temperature drop to near freezing. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, tall and slender, clothed in the same twisted bark as the guardians they had seen earlier. This one was different, though. It was no longer just a hollow, tortured figure. It was alive, its eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural light. Its face was twisted in pain, and it groaned with an agonizing, almost guttural sound. The creature's voice boomed again, but this time, it was tinged with something else, something almost like amusement. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The forest will rise again and nothing will remain." Ellie held up her hand, a signal to stop. She looked at the others. "You have to sever the root at the tree's core. The creature's power is tied to it. If we destroy it, we can weaken the thing enough to send it back." Jake's heart raced. "How do we destroy it?" Ellie closed her eyes for a brief moment, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "The blade. The one hidden in the roots of the tree. The ancient blade of the forest. It can sever the heart, but it is cursed. It takes a life to wield it. That's why it hasn't been used in centuries." "Then we won't do it," Claire exclaimed, her voice rising in panic. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Ellie replied, her tone grim. "You can't defeat it without a price." Before anyone could respond, the tree's roots surged forward, crashing down like massive tendrils, wrapping around their legs, pulling them toward the ground. Jake fought against the force, but it was no use. The roots were too strong, their grip suffocating. Ellie reached out, her fingers brushing the bark of the tree as it pulsed beneath her touch. She closed her eyes, then spoke softly as if to herself, "The price must be paid." The ground beneath their feet cracked open, and a sickening, deep sound filled the air. The roots receded momentarily, and there, lying at the center of the tree's heart, was a blade. It gleamed faintly, its edges lined with strange runes, glowing with an eerie, blood-red light. Jake's eyes widened in horror as he understood what Ellie meant. This wasn't just a blade, it was a cursed weapon, forged to sever the connection between the creature and the heart of the forest. And someone would have to use it. "I'll do it," Ellie said, her voice cold and firm. She stepped forward, but before she could take the blade, Jake's hand shot out to stop her. "No, not you." But Ellie was already shaking her head. "It has to be done. I brought you here. I'm the one who woke it up. This is the price I have to pay." Her eyes met his, resolute, filled with a quiet sadness. "I knew the moment we stepped into the forest that this would happen. The creature, it's my burden to bear." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but the ground trembled again. The creature's dark laugh filled the chamber, low and mocking. "Do you truly believe you can stop me?" Ellie raised the blade high, the air around her crackling with power. "This is the only way." As her hand descended, a burst of light exploded from the blade, and everything around them seemed to implode in a flash of brilliant white. The roots recoiled, the tree trembled, and the air was filled with a deafening scream that echoed through the chamber like a dying cry. The moment Ellie's hand descended with the blade, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air became electric, crackling with a sharp, static tension that vibrated through every inch of Jake's body. The blade gleamed with an unnatural light, its runes glowing brighter with each passing second, as if it were alive. Time stretched, drawn out by the force of the moment. Then, with a sickening, resonant crack, the blade struck the core of the tree. The sound was a horrible, unearthly roar, a noise that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The tree's bark splintered under the blade's strike, sending shards of jagged stone flying through the air, scattering across the chamber like glass. The roots recoiled as though in pain, and the ground itself trembled violently, shaking beneath their feet. The mist that had once swirled around the creature now began to swirl violently around the room, twisting in on itself like a storm. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The pulse of energy from the blade's strike was so intense that he felt it in his bones, the very marrow vibrating as if his entire being was being torn apart. The glow of the blade intensified, and for a moment, everything went white. Then there was a terrible silence. The air settled and the world seemed to slow. Jake blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, but the whiteness in his mind wouldn't fade. He could still feel the presence of the creature looming behind him, the darkness pressing against him like a physical force, but it felt distant, faint, as if its power was beginning to dissipate. Ellie was still standing before the tree, her hand gripping the blade, her face pale and drawn. But something had changed. The mist around the tree was no longer swirling with the same ferocity. The glow of the runes had dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. The enormous form of the creature, once towering and oppressive, seemed to flicker, its shape warping, unstable, as if the very essence of its being was unraveling. But Ellie was not moving. She stood frozen, her eyes wide as if she had forgotten how to blink. Her hand, still clutching the blade, hung at her side. The blade's glow had dimmed, but a faint, ethereal light still emanated from its edge, casting strange shadows across her face. Jake rushed forward, but a cold, invisible force slammed into his chest, sending him stumbling back. The creature, though flickering and weakening, was still there. Its presence was suffocating, a dark, all-encompassing weight. It growled, its voice now a low, trembling whisper, like a broken thing trying to cling to the remnants of its power. "You have broken the seal," it hissed, its voice cracking as if it were being pulled apart by some unseen force. "But do you think this will stop me?" Ellie's voice was barely audible as she raised her eyes to meet Jake's. Her breath was shallow, and her body trembled as if she were caught in a war between life and death. The air around her had grown heavy, thick with the force of the sacrifice she had just made. I did what I had to do," Ellie whispered, her words laced with a deep, painful exhaustion. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, the blade slipping from her grip as if it no longer had the strength to remain in her hand. Jake reached for her, his hands trembling as he caught her before she hit the stone floor. Her body was cold, colder than it should have been, and as he held her, he realized that something vital, something of her essence, had been taken. No, Ellie," Jake gasped, his voice thick with desperation. He shook her gently, but her eyes remained closed, her body still and limp in his arms. Ellie's lips parted, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was a sad, weary smile, a smile that spoke of sacrifice, of acceptance. "Jake, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I did this to save you, to stop it from taking everything. I couldn't let it be too late." Jake's chest tightened, his heart shattering in his chest. You're not done yet. You can't be." But Ellie's smile faded, and the light in her eyes dimmed, as if some part of her was slipping away. She let out a soft sigh, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world held its breath, waiting for her to speak once more. "I wish I could." Ellie's voice trailed off, her body relaxing in his arms as if the weight of the world had finally fallen off her shoulders. "No," Jake shouted, the sound echoing through the cavern, shaking the very walls. "Don't leave me. Don't leave us here." But it was too late. Ellie's body went limp in his arms, and with that final exhale, she was gone. The weight of her sacrifice hung heavy in the air, the very atmosphere now thick with the finality of it. Jake couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was frozen, his heart torn between grief and the overwhelming realization that they had failed. And then, like a switch being flipped, the chamber seemed to explode with energy. The creature's form, though flickering and broken, began to howl in rage. Its voice, no longer a whisper, was now an earth-shattering scream that shook the cavern, rattling the stone walls around them. The light in the blade dimmed entirely, and the remnants of the tree's dark power seemed to be pulled back into the creature. Its form began to solidify again, more powerful than before. The guardians, now fully corrupted, their bodies twitching and jerking in unnatural patterns, surrounded them, their eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. They were no longer the tortured, empty shells they had once been. They had become extensions of the creature itself, willing servants of its malevolent will. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. The creature was recovering. Its power was not broken, not yet. It was still alive. The forest still pulsed with its dark energy. But Ellie's sacrifice had not been in vain. The air felt different now. The walls of the cavern trembled as if they were echoing the scream of the dying tree. A crack ran down the center of the forest floor, and for a brief moment, Jake saw something gleaming beneath the surface. A sliver of light, pure and untouched by the darkness. It was the heart of the forest, and it was still alive. Ellie had given everything to save them, to weaken the creature. But the final battle wasn't over yet. There was still a chance. A way to destroy it completely. Jake stood up, the weight of grief heavy in his chest, but a new, burning determination beginning to form. They couldn't let Ellie's death be in vain. They couldn't let the forest and the creature win. And so, with a final defiant glance at the flickering form of the creature, Jake took the first step toward the heart of the forest. He had to finish what Ellie had started. There was no turning back. Jake's heart thundered in his chest as he stood alone in the center of the cavern, Ellie's lifeless body still cradled in his arms. His mind screamed for him to act, to fight, but the overwhelming grief was almost paralyzing. She had sacrificed herself for them, for the chance to stop the creature, and now it was up to him to see that sacrifice through. But he couldn't just leave her behind. He couldn't leave her like this. With a final desperate glance at her peaceful face, Jake gently laid her down on the cold stone floor. The sound of the creature's growls, the rumbling, bone-shaking growls, filled the chamber, reverberating through the very stone beneath his feet. It was coming back to life. The tree was starting to rebuild itself, the roots stirring, the ground cracking beneath them. The creature had been wounded, but it wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Jake wiped his tears away with the back of his hand, the sting of salt on his skin mixing with the coldness of the chamber's air. He could hear the guardians' unnatural screeches, the sound of their broken, tortured bodies moving through the dark mist that was slowly choking the room. But Ellie's sacrifice had bought him a chance. The creature's power had waned, the cracks in the earth, the heartbeat of the forest, were all signs that it was not invincible. And that's when he saw it, the faint glow just beneath the surface of the broken ground. The heart. The pulse of the forest, the very core of its being, was buried deep beneath the roots of the ancient tree. It was what powered the creature, what fueled its dominion over the land. The blade that Ellie had wielded had struck at its heart, weakening it, but the creature was not gone. Not yet. The path to the heart was clear. Taking a deep breath, Jake turned away from Ellie's body and stepped toward the shattered roots of the tree. The dark mist began to churn violently, swirling around him like a storm, trying to push him back. He felt a cold tendril brush against his arm, sending a shiver through him, but he pushed it away, his resolve hardening. The guardians were closing in, their hollow eyes fixed on him with hunger, their bodies jerking unnaturally. They were coming for him, but he couldn't focus on them. Not now. His eyes were fixed on the pulse of light beneath the roots, the heart of the forest. He had to destroy it. He had to finish what Ellie had started. Without looking back, he ran toward the epicenter of the creature's power, his feet pounding against the stone floor, his every muscle screaming in protest. He could hear the guardian's footsteps behind him, growing louder, closer, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. He had to keep moving. The walls of the cavern seemed to close in on him as he neared the tree. The mist became thicker, more suffocating. It wrapped around his body, pulling at him, trying to drag him down. His lungs burned for air, but he pressed forward, reaching the roots that had once been a beautiful, powerful symbol of life. Now they were twisted, dark, and deadly, like the hands of the creature itself, reaching out to claim him. He was almost there. The ground in front of him cracked, and a deep rumbling sound filled the air. The roots recoiled, retreating slightly as if the heart itself was resisting him. But Jake wasn't afraid anymore. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. He reached out and placed his hands against the ground, feeling the heat emanating from the cracks, the pulsing rhythm that matched the beat of his own heart. There it was, beneath the earth, beneath the roots. The light. A single, pure light that cut through the oppressive darkness. The moment his hands touched the earth, a violent surge of energy coursed through him, and the ground beneath him shuddered. The heart was alive, and it was powerful. The creature roared in fury, a deafening screech that echoed through the cavern, reverberating in Jake's chest. The guardians were almost upon him now, their twisted bodies lurching toward him, their claws reaching for his flesh. But Jake didn't move. He couldn't move. He was locked in place by the force of the heart, the power of the forest. It was trying to stop him, but he wouldn't stop. With a primal scream, Jake slammed his hands down into the crack, feeling the pulse of the heart grow stronger, the light growing brighter. The roots around him began to writhe, snapping and twisting like serpents, but he was not afraid. The blade, Ellie's blade, was still lying at the edge of the tree's roots. It called to him. He had to act now. Jake reached for the blade, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and he could feel the power coursing through it, the same power that had been wielded by Ellie. The blade was still alive with energy, its runes faintly glowing with a red, violent light. It was the only weapon that could sever the heart. But there was a price. Jake could feel it. A coldness creeping into his bones, the same chill that had overtaken Ellie. The blade demanded something from him, just as it had from her. But he had no choice. If he didn't use it, if he didn't sever the heart, everything would be lost. The creature would be reborn, and the forest would fall into darkness forever. His grip tightened on the blade, the runes flaring brighter as the creature's scream grew louder, more desperate. The guardians were nearly upon him, their screeches filling his ears, but he ignored them. He raised the blade above the crack, just above the heart, and with a single defiant motion, he plunged it down. The world exploded. The blade sank into the earth, into the heart of the forest, and a shockwave of power rippled outward, sending the guardians tumbling back, their shrieks turning into gurgles of pain. The roots recoiled, the ground splitting open as the heart's pulse faltered. The air around him trembled, crackling with raw, ancient energy. For a moment, everything was still. And then the heart began to disintegrate. The light that had once burned so brightly began to flicker and fade, as if the very essence of the forest was being torn apart. The roots shriveled and died, their once mighty presence withering into dust. The tree's massive trunk cracked and splintered, groaning as though it were in agony. The creature's form, once towering and powerful, began to unravel. Its dark, swirling body flickered like a dying flame, and the mist that had enveloped the cavern began to dissipate, swirling away like smoke on the wind. And then, with a final echoing cry, the creature shattered. Its form collapsed inward, the darkness evaporating into nothingness. The cavern fell silent. Jake stood there, breathless, the blade still in his hand, the remnants of the heart's power still pulsing in the ground beneath him. The guardians, their twisted bodies now lifeless, crumpled to the floor, their eyes empty and blank. The forest was still, silent, felt different now. The air was clearer, the mist gone, and the oppressive weight that had filled the chamber had lifted. The dark power that had once threatened to consume everything was gone. But at what cost? Ellie's sacrifice had been the key, and though the creature was no more, Jake could not shake the weight of what had happened. The forest would heal. The land would recover. But he would never forget the cost of saving it. He knelt beside Ellie's body, his hand trembling as he brushed a lock of hair from her face. She was gone. But her sacrifice had not been in vain. And now, as the darkness finally lifted, Jake knew one thing for certain. The forest was free. But the price of that freedom would remain with him forever. The cavern had fallen into a profound silence. The last echoes of the creature's rage had dissolved into the walls, leaving behind only the faintest hum of energy. Jake's hands shook as he stood over Ellie's body, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavy in his chest. The blade, still gleaming with an eerie, faint light, lay discarded at his feet, its runes dimming as though it had fulfilled its purpose. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding in his ears, each beat a painful reminder of what they had lost. His mind was still reeling, still trying to process everything, the battle, the sacrifice, the unbearable loss. Ellie had given everything to save them, to stop the creature, and now she was gone. The world around him felt too quiet, too still. There was no wind, no rain, no sound of the forest beyond. The thick, choking mist that had once consumed the chamber had vanished, leaving only the bare stone walls and the remnants of what had once been a mighty, ancient force. Jake leaned down and gently took Ellie's hand in his. It was cold now, lifeless, the warmth that had once been there snuffed out in an instant. He squeezed it gently, but there was no response, no spark of life. The tears that had long threatened to fall finally broke free, streaming down his face, but even they felt out of place in the oppressive quiet. The world had shifted so drastically in such a short time. The forest had been saved, but at a terrible cost. His mind drifted back to the moment he had heard Ellie's last words, the way she had looked at him with such quiet acceptance. She had known. She had known what the blade would demand of her. And still she had gone forward. She had given her life for this moment, for them. And now what remained? What was left in the wake of that kind of sacrifice? Ellie? His voice cracked as he whispered her name, the words seeming to reverberate off the stone walls, as though the cavern itself was echoing the loss. But there was no answer, only the hollow silence that filled the space. In that silence, something stirred, something he hadn't noticed before. The ground beneath him was still warm, almost vibrating with residual energy. Jake's eyes flicked toward the shattered remains of the tree. The roots that had once pulsed with dark power now lay still, but there was something different in the air, a subtle shift. The heart of the forest had been severed, but its remnants were still there, pulsing faintly. The very land seemed to hum in response to that pulse. Jake stood, looking around, the faint glow of the heart's remaining energy casting long shadows against the stone walls. For a moment, it felt like the entire forest was breathing with him, like he was no longer a stranger in this place but a part of it, something connected to the earth itself. The sacrifice, the destruction, the cleansing of the creature, it had all been necessary, but there was still more to do. The forest had been poisoned, corrupted by the creature's influence for centuries, and though the dark force was gone, the land still bore the scars. Jake knew what he had to do. He moved toward the shattered tree, the remnants of its once mighty roots scattered across the ground. He knelt beside the broken stump, his hand hovering over the jagged edges of the bark. There was no more mist now, no more foreboding darkness. But there was a subtle pulse beneath his fingers, a heartbeat that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. The forest was still alive, but its energy had been shifted, altered by the creature's reign. He closed his eyes, feeling that pulse deep within him, connecting with it. The earth beneath him seemed to respond, shifting ever so slightly, like it was listening, waiting. The heartbeat was steady but weak, like the land itself had been wounded, a scar that ran deeper than just the physical realm. For the first time since entering the forest, Jake felt a strange sense of peace. The creature was gone, the guardians had fallen, and the curse that had gripped the land was finally being broken. Ellie had done more than just stop the creature. She had created the opening for the forest to heal. Her sacrifice was not just a battle won, but a restoration of balance, a chance for life to return. The only question now was, could they truly heal it? He closed his hand into a fist, pressing it against the earth, feeling the pulse beneath the soil. The forest was still alive, even if it was broken. It would take time, but it would heal. The roots that had been twisted by the creature's influence could be pruned, could be nurtured back to life. The energy that had once been dark and suffocating could be redirected, made whole again. The land was resilient. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, quiet but firm. It was Claire. "Jake, are you okay?" He looked up to see Claire and Daniel approaching him slowly, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the exhaustion of the ordeal. They were covered in dirt and grime, but alive. They had survived. They had made it through. Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at Ellie's body, his eyes lingering for a moment before he stood up. "We're alive," he said, his voice thick but steady. "We survived. But she's gone." Claire's face softened, her eyes filled with sorrow. "She saved us, Jake. She saved the forest. And you helped. You finished what she started." He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The loss was too much, too fresh to put into words. But somehow Claire's words struck a chord within him. Ellie had given her life to ensure that they survived. But it wasn't just their survival she had fought for, it was the survival of everything that had been tainted, everything that had been corrupted by the creature's darkness. "She didn't want us to just survive," Jake said, his voice quieter now. "She wanted us to make sure this forest, this place, was whole again." Daniel nodded, his face grim. "And we will. The forest's heart is still beating. We can restore it." The three of them stood in the silence that followed, looking around at the cavern. The now dead roots, the shattered tree, the emptiness left in the wake of the creature's destruction. It wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. Jake's heart felt heavy, but for the first time since they had entered the forest, he felt a flicker of hope. They could rebuild. It would take time. It would take work. But they could restore the land, and in doing so, they would honor Ellie's sacrifice. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was still a long way to go, but the first step was clear. They had to start healing the forest, nurturing it back to life, just as Ellie had done for them. And as the light from the blade flickered out, the cavern around them seemed to breathe once more, the weight of the creature's influence lifting from the land. But in the back of Jake's mind, one thought echoed through the stillness. They were only at the beginning. There would be more trials ahead. The forest was vast, and its heart, though it had survived this battle, was not yet fully restored. But for the first time, Jake believed they could do it. They could heal the land just as they had survived the horrors of the past days. Ellie had given them that chance. And now, it was up to them to make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. The weight of Ellie's sacrifice still hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, but Jake knew what had to be done. He couldn't let her death be in vain, couldn't allow the forest to remain scarred and broken, as though the creature's reign had left an irreversible mark. Ellie had given everything to sever the creature's power. Now it was their turn to heal what had been destroyed. Jake turned away from the shattered remnants of the tree and faced his companions, Claire and Daniel, who stood a few feet away, watching him with quiet understanding. The moment felt fragile, like a delicate thread holding them together. The world had been shattered, their lives upended, but there was a new kind of determination in the air, a sense of resolve. "We can't do this alone," Jake said, his voice steady now, though it still carried the weight of their shared grief. We have to work together. This forest, this place, it's not just land. It's alive. It can be healed. But we need to give it the chance to recover. Claire nodded, her face set in a grim expression. She was tired. Her eyes were hollow, dark circles beneath them, but there was a fire in her gaze. The fire of someone who had been through hell and emerged with a single, clear purpose. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "We'll do it, Jake," she said softly. "We'll rebuild it. For her. For everyone." Daniel, always the quiet one, spoke next. "The forest won't heal overnight. It'll take years, maybe decades. But the heart's still here. It's alive. And we can give it the strength to grow again." Jake looked at them both, feeling the strength of their words settle deep in his bones. They had been through so much together, but this was different. This was not just survival. This was about restoring what had been torn apart, not just the forest, but themselves. They had all been broken by the creature's power, by Ellie's sacrifice. But they could heal too. They could rebuild what had been shattered piece by piece. "We need to focus on the heart," Jake said, his voice gaining strength. "It's still there beneath the roots. If we can tap into it, maybe we can help it grow, help it regain its power. We can't just wait for it to heal on its own." Claire nodded, her eyes narrowing as she thought. "We'll need to draw on the forest's energy, its essence. It's not just about planting seeds or waiting for the trees to regrow. We need to help the land find its rhythm again." Daniel took a deep breath and looked around the cavern, his gaze lingering on the broken remnants of the tree. The mist had receded, but the air still felt heavy, as though the land was holding its breath, waiting for something. "We'll have to move carefully," Daniel said. "The heart is still raw. We can't rush it. But if we're patient, if we treat the land with care, we can start the healing." Jake glanced back at Ellie's body, a pang of sorrow tightening in his chest. She had given her life to bring them to this moment. Her last act had been one of love, for the forest, for the land, for them. She had known the cost, and she had embraced it anyway. Her sacrifice would not be forgotten. With that resolve settled in his chest, Jake turned toward the center of the cavern. The cracked ground still hummed faintly with the heartbeat of the forest, and the faint pulse of light from the shattered trees' remnants flickered in the darkness. The roots that had once twisted with dark energy now lay still, broken. "Let's start," Jake said, his voice firm, yet filled with a sense of calm purpose. "We'll work together. We'll do this right. For Ellie. For everything." The three of them moved toward the center of the cavern, where the heart's pulse was strongest. They knelt beside the jagged crack in the stone, their hands hovering over the warm earth, the remnants of the creature's power still thrumming beneath the surface. The forest's pulse was weak, but it was there, alive, waiting. Jake closed his eyes and placed his hand against the ground, feeling the rhythm of the earth beneath his fingertips. It was faint, but there was something there, something fragile but persistent. The land was calling to them. It needed their help. Claire and Daniel mirrored his actions, each of them placing their hands on the ground, focusing on the pulse of energy that still resonated beneath the surface. Jake could feel the power in their touch, the shared connection between them. This wasn't just about physical strength, it was about a unity of purpose. Together they could make the land feel alive again. They began to hum, softly at first, a low melodic tone that seemed to resonate with the land itself. The hum grew louder, their voices harmonizing, reverberating through the cavern. It was a song of healing, a prayer to the earth, a promise that they would restore what had been broken. As they sang, the pulse of the heart grew stronger, brighter, though it was still faint. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, as if the land itself was listening to their song. The broken roots around them began to twitch, like something was waking deep within the earth. The warmth that had once been fleeting became a steady heat, spreading outward, flowing through the cracks in the stone, reaching toward the dead soil. The song stretched on, each note building in strength, pulling at the very core of the forest. Jake's hands burned with the power they were channeling, the energy that pulsed through him, through all of them. It felt like they were tapping into something ancient, something deeper than they had ever known. The heart of the forest responded. A light began to grow in the center of the cavern, bright and pure, shining through the cracks in the stone like the first rays of dawn breaking through the night. It was the light of rebirth, the essence of life itself. The dark power that had once consumed the land was dissipating, fading like mist in the morning sun. Jake's heart surged with hope as he watched the ground around them begin to shift. The broken roots twitched once more, slowly at first, but then faster, as if life was returning to them. The soil itself began to stir, and small, delicate shoots of green began to push through the cracked earth. They were not the twisted, corrupted roots that had once been there, but fresh, new growth, life that had not been tainted by the creature's power. Claire smiled softly, her eyes sparkling with the first hint of joy they had felt since entering the forest. "It's working," she whispered. "It's really working." The three of them continued to sing, their voices rising in a final, triumphant chord. The light from the heart grew brighter, more intense, and the once dead forest around them seemed to awaken. The tree, though shattered, began to heal, its bark slowly knitting together. The roots began to spread, reaching deep into the earth, drawing on the energy they had awakened. Jake felt it, a shift. The land was no longer poisoned. The forest was no longer dead. It was alive, breathing, thriving. And with that realization, the pulse of the heart began to settle, no longer frantic but steady, calm, as though it had found its rhythm once again. They had done it. The forest was healing. But Jake knew that this was only the beginning. The forest would need time, patience, and care to fully recover, but the path forward had been cleared. Ellie's sacrifice had not been in vain. They had honored her, and now they could begin the long process of rebuilding what had been lost. Together they would restore the heart of the forest. The forest breathed again, and with it, the weight that had crushed their spirits began to lift. The air felt lighter, freer, and the oppressive silence that had once filled the cavern was now replaced with a soft, gentle hum, the sound of life stirring in every corner of the land. The once dead roots were now covered in vibrant green tendrils, stretching upward, reaching toward the light of the newly reborn heart. The ground beneath them shifted with a sense of purpose, as if the forest itself had found its rhythm again. Jake stood up slowly, his hands still resting on the ground, feeling the subtle vibrations of the earth beneath him. The energy had shifted, no longer dark and consuming, but full of potential. The air smelled fresher now, rich with the scent of growing things. It was a smell that spoke of new beginnings, of a future still unwritten. Claire and Daniel stood beside him, their eyes wide with wonder. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, their faces were lit with something other than fear or sorrow. The forest had been restored, but there was still much to do. The long road of healing had only just begun. "We did it," Claire whispered, almost as if she couldn't believe it. "We actually did it." Jake nodded slowly, his chest tight with emotion. He hadn't allowed himself to fully process everything that had happened. He still couldn't quite grasp the enormity of what they had accomplished. Ellie was gone, her sacrifice leaving an irreplaceable hole in their hearts, but she had given them the chance to restore the forest, to give it a future. They had honored that sacrifice, and now they were tasked with ensuring that the work didn't stop here. "We did," he said, his voice hoarse but full of resolve. "But this isn't over. The forest is healing, but it'll take time. It needs care, it needs attention. And we need to make sure we're here to help it." Daniel stepped forward, his eyes focused on the light pulsing in the center of the cavern, the heart of the forest. "We can't just leave," he said quietly. "Not yet. There's still so much we need to do. We can't walk away and assume it'll fix itself. The land needs us." Jake turned to him, his gaze meeting Daniel's. The quiet determination in his voice was clear. "You're right. But the forest isn't the only thing that needs healing." Claire's eyes softened as she looked from Daniel to Jake, and for the first time, she seemed to understand exactly what he meant. They had come to the forest seeking answers, seeking to survive, but the journey had changed them. They had faced their darkest fears, confronted unimaginable horrors, and emerged from it scarred but alive. The forest had been saved, but they had also been altered. Jake could feel it. The shadows of the past still lingered, but the light from the heart of the forest was powerful, healing. It was as though the forest had given them a second chance, just as Ellie had given them one. "We can't undo what's been done," Claire said softly, "but we can move forward. We can rebuild. Not just the forest, but ourselves too." Jake felt a wave of gratitude and sorrow wash over him. The bond between them had been forged in the most unimaginable of circumstances. They had relied on each other, and in the process, they had found strength in places they never thought they would. But that strength hadn't come from the forest or the creature. It had come from them, from their shared resilience. Ellie had been their anchor, and now it was up to them to ensure that her sacrifice wasn't forgotten, to carry forward the lessons they had learned in the depths of the dark. Jake's eyes drifted back to Ellie's body, still resting on the cold stone floor. He felt her absence deeply, the echo of her courage reverberating through him. She had fought so they could live, and now it was his turn to honor that. He couldn't afford to give in to despair. Not when the future was within reach. "I think we should stay," Jake said, his voice steady and resolute. "We owe it to Ellie. We owe it to this place. The forest is still weak. We have to protect it, help it grow strong again." Daniel nodded. I agree. We have to stay and see this through. Claire placed a hand on Jake's arm, her grip warm and reassuring. Then it's decided. We'll stay. We'll help the forest. Together. Jake looked at her, at Daniel, and then back at the reborn land surrounding them. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were part of something greater. They had been given a chance to restore not just the forest, but the world that had been so nearly lost. The three of them turned back to the heart of the forest, the pulse of light growing brighter as the land healed. It was as though the very essence of the forest was listening to them, responding to their presence. The wind, which had been still for so long, began to stir once again, rustling the leaves of the new trees that had begun to sprout from the soil. Birds began to sing, their songs carrying on the breeze, filling the air with life. The sound of the river that ran through the forest, once drowned out by the creature's power, could now be heard once again, a clear, soothing rush of water. The trees around them, though still young and fragile, seemed to stand taller, as though drawing strength from the light of the heart. They were not the twisted, blackened husks that had once choked the life from the land. They were fresh, vibrant, their trunks straight and strong. The new roots that had begun to sprout were healthy, each one reaching for the light that now bathed the forest in a warm, golden glow. We're not just healing the forest, Claire said, her voice filled with awe. We're growing it. We're giving it a new chance to live. Jake nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and grief. He felt Ellie's presence in the very air around them, in the pulse of the forest. She was here, in the rebirth of the land, in the strength of their resolve. She had given everything, and now it was up to them to carry on. But there was still so much to do. The land had been wounded deeply, its heart had been severed, but they could see the signs of recovery now. The forest was not just alive, it was thriving. It needed care, nurturing, patience, and they would give it all of that and more. They would stay as long as it took to restore the balance. As they stood in the center of the forest, the pulse of the heart growing stronger, they knew that their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. They would continue their work in the forest, protecting it from the darkness that had once threatened to consume it. They would rebuild the land and honor Ellie's sacrifice by ensuring that this forest and its heart would endure. For as long as the forest lived, they would live too. And with that thought in their hearts, they took their first steps forward into the future. A future built from the ashes of the past, but filled with the promise of new life. The days that followed were filled with purpose and quiet determination. The forest, though young and fragile, had begun to heal, but it was not without its challenges. The pulse of life, which had been so faint in the aftermath of the creature's death, was now growing stronger. The land seemed to respond to their presence, eager to return to its natural state, yet there were wounds that would not fade easily. There were cracks in the earth, poisoned roots that still needed cleansing, and the memory of the darkness that had once tainted the forest lingered in the shadows. Jake, Claire, and Daniel knew their work had only just begun. The first step was simple but essential. They needed to care for the heart. The tree had been shattered, its once mighty trunk broken in places, the roots twisted and burnt. But the heart, the very source of the forest's life, was intact. Barely. They had to nourish it, protect it, and give it time to grow strong again. They spent their days reinforcing the weakened roots, digging channels in the soil to allow the fresh, pure water to flow directly to the core of the heart. Jake spent hours each day kneeling in the earth, his hands covered in dirt as he carefully nurtured the heart of the forest, channeling the pulse of energy that had begun to hum beneath the soil. He could feel it, a steady beat, deep and rhythmic like the heartbeat of the earth itself. He could sense the life that still lay beneath the surface, waiting to break free. Each time he placed his hands on the ground, a surge of power filled him, and with it, a deep sense of connection. The forest was alive. It was growing, but it was fragile. Claire, with her quiet determination, focused on the younger trees. The once twisted saplings that had been infected by the creature's dark influence were slowly being pruned and tended to. She would take her time, carefully removing the dead branches, encouraging the healthy shoots to grow. Her attention to detail was unmatched, and Jake often found her sitting beneath the trees, her eyes closed, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest around her. She had become one with the land, and every action she took was an expression of that bond. Daniel, ever the thinker, spent much of his time studying the patterns of the forest. He mapped out the areas where the darkness had been most concentrated, where the earth still trembled faintly with the echoes of the creature's influence. He collected soil samples, measured the water levels, and monitored the creatures that had begun to return to the land. His meticulous observations were vital. They couldn't just restore the forest physically, They had to understand the ecological balance that had been disrupted so they could guide it back to health. Together, they formed a system, each of them focused on a different aspect of the healing process, but all working toward the same goal, to restore the forest to its former glory. The bond between them had deepened in the days that followed, not just as survivors, but as stewards of the land. They had been brought together by fate, by necessity, but now they were united by something greater. They were part of this place, and this place was part of them. One evening, after a long day of tending to the trees, Jake found himself standing by the edge of the clearing where the heart of the forest pulsed with life. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden light. The air was cool, with the faintest hint of mist creeping in from the edges of the forest. He stood there, taking in the sight before him. The trees swaying gently in the breeze, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the sky, the sounds of the night coming to life around him. It was a peaceful moment, but Jake knew that peace would be fleeting. The forest was healing, but it was still vulnerable. There would always be challenges, new threats, old scars, and the weight of their own memories to carry. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He thought of Ellie, of her final sacrifice, and how it had changed everything. She had given her life for this moment, the chance to restore the forest, the chance to undo the creature's reign. It was a gift, a debt that could never truly be repaid. But they could honor it. They could build on the foundation she had laid. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Claire and Daniel appeared from the shadows, their faces tired but content, their hands still stained with the earth they had worked so hard to restore. Claire smiled softly when she saw him standing there, lost in thought. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jake turned to face her, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Yeah, just thinking." "About Ellie?" Daniel asked quietly, stepping forward to stand beside them. Jake nodded, his gaze returning to the heart of the forest. "She gave us a chance to make this right. We can't waste it. We can't forget what she did for us." "We won't," Claire said firmly. "We'll keep going. For her." The three of them stood there for a moment, watching as the first stars twinkled above, the soft hum of the forest filling the air. It was as if the forest itself had found its own rhythm, a pulse that matched their own. There was no turning back. They had crossed the threshold of the past, and now the future awaited them, unwritten but full of possibility. The work ahead was daunting. The forest was vast, and its recovery would take years, perhaps longer. There were still remnants of the creature's darkness to purge from the land, and many areas would need careful cultivation and monitoring. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt a sense of hope. The forest was alive, and it would thrive again. They would ensure that. And yet, despite the work that lay ahead, there was something else stirring within him. A deep, abiding sense of peace. The forest was alive. They were alive. Together, they had done something no one had thought possible. They had defeated the creature, restored the heart of the forest, and reclaimed the land from the darkness. But there was more than just the forest healing to focus on. The land had a way of weaving its own lessons into the hearts of those who worked with it. In tending to the earth, they had also begun to tend to themselves. Each day spent among the trees, each moment spent listening to the pulse of the earth, had healed wounds that ran deeper than the physical. Jake wasn't the same person who had wandered into the forest weeks ago, desperate and lost. He had changed. And as he looked around at Claire and Daniel, he saw the same transformation in them. They had all been broken in different ways, but in restoring the land, they had also restored something within themselves. "This is just the beginning," Jake said softly, breaking the silence. "We've done so much, but there's so much more to do. Not just for the forest, but for ourselves. We've got a long road ahead." Claire nodded. "But we've made it this far. We've fought through the darkness. We can keep going." Daniel smiled, his usual quiet resolve evident in his eyes. "We will. Together." And in that moment, as the stars above them blinked in the deepening night, Jake knew that the forest would recover. They would continue the work that Ellie had started. They would rebuild the heart of the forest, and in doing so, they would rebuild their own hearts as well. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. And that was all they needed. The seasons passed, each one bringing with it a new layer of change, not just to the forest, but to the people who had come to call this place their home. Time moved with the patient rhythm of the earth, slow but inevitable, and in its wake, the land that had once been so scarred by darkness began to bloom again. It had been 2 years since they had first arrived in the forest. 2 years of hard work, quiet moments, and steady progress. The forest, though still young in places, had begun to thrive. The trees that had once stood blackened and twisted now grew tall and strong, their trunks thick and sturdy, their leaves vibrant with green. The creatures of the forest had returned in droves, deer grazing on the fresh grass, birds nesting in the towering branches, and the river, once tainted by the creatures' influence, now ran clear and fast, its waters sparkling under the sun. The heart of the forest, which had been nothing more than a fragile ember when they had first restored it, now pulsed with life, strong and steady. It had grown, deep roots had spread beneath the soil, pulling in the nutrients needed to support the land, while branches reached skyward, sheltering the earth beneath them. It was no longer just a symbol of survival, but a living testament to the resilience of the forest, and the people who had given it a second chance. Jake, Claire, and Daniel had worked tirelessly to ensure the forest remained strong, each of them dedicating themselves fully to the restoration process. In the early days they had worked long hours, only stopping when the light faded from the sky, their muscles sore, their bodies tired. There had been no time for rest, no time for reflection. The forest needed them and they gave it everything they had. But as the years passed, something changed. They had settled into a rhythm, a pattern of life that was both fulfilling and quiet. The constant sense of urgency had faded, replaced with the slow but steady growth of something permanent. The forest, and with it, their lives, had found a new balance. Jake often found himself sitting beneath the tallest tree, the one that had once been the epicenter of the creature's power, now flourishing with thick, green leaves and flowering vines. It was a place of peace for him, a place to remember Ellie, to reflect on how far they had come, and to understand that her sacrifice had not been in vain. The heart of the forest beat beneath his feet, and every time he sat there, he felt a deep connection to the land, as though he had become part of it, just as it had become part of him. Claire had become something of a guardian of the young trees, the saplings that now dotted the forest floor, delicate and vulnerable. She would often spend hours in the woods, walking between the young trunks, her hands brushing against the leaves as if reassuring them. She had a natural gift for nurturing life, and it showed in the way the trees seemed to thrive in her presence. Her bond with the forest was unspoken, but deep, and it was clear to Jake that she had found her calling. Daniel, ever the scholar, had turned his attention to the study of the forest's ecosystem. He had built a small cabin near the river, where he could observe the flow of water, the creatures that visited the banks, and the subtle shifts in the landscape. He kept a meticulous journal of everything he saw, documenting the progress of the land's recovery. But it wasn't just the physical restoration that consumed him, it was the deeper understanding of the forest itself, of how life could flourish after such destruction. He had become a historian of sorts, preserving the lessons of the land for future generations. Together they had built something beautiful. Not just a forest, but a community, a place where the pain of the past could be slowly forgotten, replaced by the quiet beauty of growth and healing. But even in this place of renewal, there was still a sense of unfinished business, something they could all feel but never quite name. One late autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Jake stood once more by the heart of the forest. The air was cool, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves, and the scent of pine and earth filled his lungs. The world felt peaceful, but there was a quiet tension in the air, like the land was holding its breath. Claire and Daniel joined him after a few moments, their presence a quiet comfort. They stood together, side by side, looking out at the forest they had helped to restore. "It's beautiful," Claire said softly, her eyes reflecting the last rays of the sun. "It's hard to believe this is the same place we found ourselves in 2 years ago." Jake nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I know, it's hard to believe. But it's not just the forest that's changed, is it?" Daniel's eyes were distant, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "No, we've changed too. All of us." Jake turned to face them, his expression serious. "We've done what we set out to do. The forest is strong again. We've honored Ellie's sacrifice. But there's still something we need to understand." "What do you mean?" Claire asked, a trace of concern in her voice. Jake took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the landscape, the forest stretching out before them. The trees were tall, the earth rich and fertile, and the air was clean. But still, something lingered at the edges of his thoughts. "There's more to this place than we've seen," Jake said quietly. "The creature is gone, yes. But the forest, it's still remembering. It's still holding on to the darkness that was once here. The heartbeat of the land, it's strong, but it's not complete. Not yet." Daniel furrowed his brow. "You think it's unfinished? That there's still something wrong?" Jake nodded slowly. "Yes, the heart's pulse is steady, but it's not what it should be. There's something deeper in this land, something older, something that we haven't fully understood. We've been restoring the surface, but there's a deeper connection here, one that goes beyond the forest and beyond what we can see. And we need to figure out what it is before it catches up to us." The silence that followed his words was heavy. Claire was the first to break it. "What do you think we should do?" Jake paused, his thoughts swirling like the autumn wind around them. "I don't know yet, but I know we can't ignore it. The forest may be healed, but I believe the land itself is still holding something back. We have to find out what it is, or it might come back to haunt us." Daniel's eyes narrowed, and he gave a sharp nod. "Then we'll find it. We'll learn what this place is hiding." Claire placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We're not running from this. We're in this together. Whatever comes next, we face it as one." Jake turned to face the two of them, a deep sense of resolve settling in his chest. The journey had changed them all in ways they couldn't fully grasp. They had come to the forest as strangers, but they had become something more, something tied to this land, to the heart that pulsed beneath their feet. They weren't just caretakers of the forest anymore. They were its protectors. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The days following their conversation were filled with an uneasy tension. The air had grown heavy in the forest, as though it too was waiting for something that had not yet revealed itself. Despite the outward signs of healing, the quiet hum of the land had shifted. The forest no longer thrummed with the pure, steady pulse of life that Jake had felt when he first touched the earth. Instead, there was something more, something older and more complicated lurking just beneath the surface. Jake spent long hours wandering the outskirts of the forest, his boots crunching through fallen leaves and damp earth. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning as if they were waking up from a long slumber. The once silent shadows now seemed to stretch just a little farther than they should, and the moon, hanging high in the sky, cast strange, long shadows on the ground. It felt as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for something to break the calm. Claire had noticed it too. There were nights when the winds howled strangely, a low, mournful cry that sounded more like a warning than the natural gusts of wind that once swept through the trees. She had heard the trees whispering, their branches seeming to speak of something unseen, something that had always been there, hiding in the folds of the land. It was as if the forest had never truly been healed, as though its wounds were deeper than anyone had realized. "We need to investigate," Jake had said one evening as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, leaving the world bathed in the cool, soft light of dusk. "There's something here. Something we missed." He had seen the concern in Claire's eyes, but she had nodded, the same quiet resolve in her face that had been there since the first days they had arrived in the forest. She had become as much a part of the land as the trees themselves, her bond to the forest as strong as the roots that reached deep beneath the earth. And yet, even she couldn't ignore the unease that hung in the air. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, had been skeptical at first, his mind focused on the restoration of the forest's ecosystems. But the subtle changes, especially the unnatural stillness that sometimes swept over the forest, had not escaped his notice. "If there's something deeper, something we've missed, we need to find out what it is," he had agreed, his voice carrying the quiet weight of his thoughts. And so, they had begun their journey into the heart of the forest once again. The path was different now. The ground that had once been broken, jagged, and scarred had healed in places, but the land was still uneven. The deeper they traveled, the more they could feel the subtle shifts beneath their feet. The ground seemed to move with them, breathing, shifting, as though it was a living thing itself. The trees, tall and strong, loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their twisted branches stretching out, casting shadows that seemed to reach for them. They came to a clearing they had not seen before, a place that felt both familiar and foreign. The trees here were ancient, their trunks gnarled and thick, their roots twisting up from the earth like fingers that sought to claw their way into the sky. The air was still, and a thick, heavy mist clung to the ground, swirling in the air like smoke. It was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just a profound, oppressive silence. Jake's heart quickened as he stepped forward, the feeling of unease growing stronger. The pulse of the forest was muted here, faint and distant, as though it had been drained. He could almost hear the land calling out, an ancient, sorrowful cry buried beneath layers of time and decay. "What is this place?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would disturb the very air around them. Jake scanned the clearing. The trees here were different. Older, their bark cracked and scarred, their branches twisted in unnatural angles. There was something deeply wrong about them. Their roots were tangled together in a way that suggested they had been fighting for space, for light, for air. Almost as if they had been forced to grow in this exact way, their very existence a struggle against something that wanted to keep them in the dark. There's something ancient here, Jake said, his voice low and strained. Something buried. I think this is where it all started. Daniel had been silent, his eyes narrowing as he studied the trees, the thick mist swirling around their feet. He walked toward the center of the clearing where a large, gnarled root jutted out from the earth, its surface slick with moisture. He crouched beside it, running his fingers along the rough bark, his brow furrowed in concentration. This root, it's not like the others, he muttered. It's almost as though it's been twisted intentionally. And look at the markings, these aren't natural. Jake stepped forward, kneeling beside Daniel. The markings on the root were faint, but they were unmistakable, symbols carved deep into the bark, their edges jagged and unnatural, as though they had been etched by something with immense power. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, glowing with an eerie, unnatural energy. It's like a seal, Jake said, his voice trembling. Something has been locked away here. But what? Claire stepped closer, her eyes scanning the surroundings. It feels like it's alive, like something is waiting to break free. Jake's thoughts raced. He had felt it, the same pulse that had once radiated from the heart of the forest, but this was different. This was dark, ancient, and deeply unsettling. The feeling was growing stronger, seeping into his bones, wrapping around his thoughts like a vine. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to grow colder, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the clearing. It was a distant rumble, a murmur that seemed to vibrate in the very ground beneath them. The mist thickened, swirling around their legs, and the trees creaked and groaned as though they were alive, straining to contain something deep within the earth. What the hell was that? Claire whispered, her voice tight with fear. Jake stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the twisted root. He felt the ground shift beneath him, the pulse now undeniable, pulsing through the earth with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, deep and steady. But this pulse was not the pure, healing energy that had once emanated from the heart of the forest. This was something older, darker. There's something buried here, Jake said, his voice grim. Something we didn't account for. I think this is the source of the corruption. The creature didn't just appear. It was summoned. This place has been holding something back for a long time. Daniel stood up, his face pale, his mind working quickly. And we've been feeding it all this time. By restoring the forest, by awakening its heart, we've awakened whatever was sealed here. The rumbling grew louder, the ground beneath their feet trembling. It felt like the land itself was reacting to their discovery, as if the earth was alive, angry, and desperate to keep its secrets hidden. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing with determination. We need to find out what it is. We need to stop it before it can break free. But as he spoke, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from the ground, sending them all stumbling back. The air crackled with energy, and the trees seemed to shudder with a strange, unnatural force. From the center of the clearing, a dark, shadowy figure began to rise, its form twisting and warping as it emerged from the earth, freed from its long imprisonment. And in that moment, Jake realized the forest's true struggle had only just begun. The air thickened with a heavy, oppressive energy as the ground trembled beneath their feet. Jake's heart raced, a primal fear coursing through him as the mist in the clearing shifted and coiled around them, like tendrils reaching for the sky. The once soft breeze had turned into a cold wind, snapping branches and sending leaves scattering in every direction. And then, from the heart of the clearing, it happened. The earth cracked, deep and wide, and from the darkened crevice something began to rise. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something much darker, a shape that flickered and writhed like smoke, yet solid and tangible. The figure rose slowly, stretching upward, its form coiling and twisting with a sense of purpose. It was massive, towering, its surface slick and shifting like liquid night. There was a presence in the air, a weight, an ancient and malevolent force that filled the space with a suffocating darkness. It was like the forest itself had given birth to this creature, a thing born of the earth's deepest fears. Jake stumbled backward, his pulse roaring in his ears as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The forest, which had once felt alive with vitality and hope, now felt like a twisted, haunted place. The ground groaned, the trees swayed violently, and a strange, low, guttural sound reverberated from deep within the figure's form, like a whisper from the past, a voice that had been buried for centuries, perhaps longer. "What is that?" Claire gasped, her voice filled with horror as she took a step back, her hands trembling. Jake's throat was dry. His mind raced, trying to understand the enormity of what they were witnessing. He knew, deep down, that this creature wasn't just a manifestation of the land's corruption. It was something far older, something far darker than any of them had anticipated. The markings on the root, the seal they had uncovered, it had been a prison, a containment for something that had been locked away for reasons they could only guess at. And now it was free. "It's not just the creature we faced before," Jake whispered, his voice strained with disbelief. This is something else. Something older." Daniel, his eyes wide, took a step closer, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "It's alive. But how?" The figure, or whatever it was, shuddered and writhed as it began to fully emerge from the earth. It was vast, its form towering above them like a dark monolith. It was neither man nor beast, but something else entirely, a collection of darkness, shadow, and shifting forms, its shape always in flux. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed faintly, two pits of glowing orange light in the heart of the void-like creature, piercing and unnatural. A voice echoed from it, deep and guttural, filled with ancient malice. "You have awakened me." The words vibrated through the very air, making Jake's chest tighten, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel the weight of the voice not just in his ears but deep in his bones. It was the voice of something ancient, something that had slumbered for longer than human memory could comprehend, something that had been sealed away for a reason. "The forest is mine." Jake's heart raced. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and churn, and the trees around them groaned, their branches twisting as though they were reaching out to the creature. The once thriving, restored forest now seemed to bow before it, as if it were acknowledging the return of something far older than itself. Claire's hand shot out to Jake's arm, her grip tight. "We have to stop it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low rumble of the creature's words. Jake nodded, but the unease in his chest deepened. They had fought the creature that had corrupted the land before, but this was different. This was something that had never truly been defeated. It had been buried, hidden away, its power sealed beneath the earth for reasons they could only now begin to understand. The creature's form seemed to expand and contract, like smoke swirling in the wind. It was vast, but it had no true shape, no true identity. It was a living nightmare, a collection of darkness given form, its tendrils curling and twisting around the trees, causing them to tremble and groan in response. "You cannot destroy what is eternal," the creature whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices speaking as one. "I am the heart of the earth. I am the shadow that runs through its veins. I am the dream of the land. And now I awaken." Jake took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the weight of the creature's words pressing against him, a suffocating presence that filled the air around them. This was no simple force of nature. This was an entity, a being as old as the earth itself, born from the shadows, born from the very core of the land. It had lived before the forest had grown, before any life had come to this place. It was the original heart of the forest, corrupted, twisted, and sealed away. But now it was free. He turned to Claire and Daniel, his eyes hard with resolve. "We have to stop it before it can fully rise. We can't let it take the forest again. We can't let it take everything." Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. "But how? Too powerful. We can't fight it directly. We need to find the source, the heart of its power. If we can disrupt that." The creature's laugh echoed through the clearing, low and mocking, as though it could read their minds. "You are too late. You have already begun to feed me. The forest has already begun to accept me once again. Your efforts are futile." But Jake wasn't listening. He was already moving, his feet carrying him toward the cracked earth where the creature had emerged. There had to be something, a way to stop it. They had broken the seal once. Maybe they could do it again. "We can't let it take control of the heart of the forest," Jake said, his voice firm. "We need to sever the connection between this thing and the land." Claire stepped forward, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We'll find a way. We'll stop it, together." The ground trembled beneath their feet, but Jake wasn't about to back down now. The forest had given them so much, hope, life, and a future, but it had also shown them the consequences of letting darkness return unchecked. The creature had been buried for a reason. The forest was no longer just a home. It was a battleground. Together, they began to move toward the center of the clearing, where the dark form of the creature loomed like a storm. They had no plan, no clear way forward. But they had something the creature did not: hope, unity, and a deep connection to this place. The battle for the forest was about to begin. The air crackled with energy, heavy and thick with the presence of the creature that loomed before them. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and resolve. There was no turning back now. The The creature had risen, and the land had begun to pulse with its power. The trees around them seemed to tremble, as if sensing the malevolent force that had returned to claim what it had lost. The mist, thick and swirling, now seemed to have a life of its own, wrapping around their legs, pulling them deeper into the darkness. Jake looked at Claire and Daniel, their faces set in grim determination. They had fought for this forest before, against the creature's corruption, against the darkness that had sought to consume it. But this was something else entirely. This was the true heart of the forest's curse, the thing that had once given rise to the terror that had nearly destroyed them. And now it was free. "We need to sever its connection to the land," Jake said, his voice tight with urgency. "If we don't, it will take control of everything. The forest will be lost again, and this time, there may be no coming back." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "I agree. But how do we sever a connection that's been alive for so long? This thing isn't just a creature. It's an ancient force. We need to find its core, its anchor to the earth." The creature's shadowy form seemed to stretch and twist, its vast tendrils lashing out like whips, wrapping around the trees and pulling them toward it. The air was thick with a dark, suffocating energy, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat that wasn't their own. The earth groaned, the roots of the trees shifting and writhing beneath the soil as though they, too, were awakening to the presence of the creature. From the center of the clearing, the creature spoke again, its voice like the sound of 1,000 whispers, each one more chilling than the last. "You cannot fight what has always been. I am the land's dream, the shadow that runs through its veins. You have woken me, and now you will die with it." Jake's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. The creature was right in one sense. It had always been here, buried beneath the earth for untold ages, a part of the land itself. It was the embodiment of darkness, the raw, untapped energy of the forest before it had been touched by life. And now that energy was free, hungry for the world it had been denied. But they couldn't let it take the forest again. Not after everything they had done. Not after all they had sacrificed. "We need to find the heart," Jake said, more to himself than to the others. "It has to be somewhere close to where it was sealed. The forest, the heart of the forest is the key." Claire stepped forward, her eyes locked on the shifting form of the creature. "It's too powerful. We can't just stand here and fight it directly. We need to disrupt its connection to the earth, to the land. We have to sever its anchor." Daniel's mind was already working, his eyes scanning the clearing, the twisted roots and strange energy that filled the air. "The anchor. I think I know where it is. If we can reach the base of the tree that first grew here, the one we restored, it might be connected to the very energy the creature feeds on. The heart itself." Jake's pulse quickened. The heart. The very thing that had once been corrupted by the creature's presence, its source of power. He turned toward the twisted tree that had once been the center of the forest's corruption, the one that had given birth to the creature's power. It was a towering, gnarled thing, its trunk thick with age and covered in strange markings, and it stood at the center of the clearing like a sentinel, its roots stretching deep into the earth. If they could sever the creature's connection to that tree, they might be able to break its hold over the forest. But getting there would be another matter entirely. The creature's form was shifting constantly, its tendrils lashing out and pulling at the land. It was everywhere now, its presence filling the entire clearing, an overwhelming mass of shadow and darkness. Every step they took toward the heart was met with resistance, the very ground beneath their feet seeming to rebel against them, the earth pulsing in time with the creature's movements. Claire stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We can do this. We have to." They moved together, keeping close, each step taking them closer to the heart of the forest, the place where the creature's power had originated. The air grew colder as they approached, the mist thickening, swirling around them like a storm. The creature's laughter echoed through the clearing, a low, mocking sound that seemed to reverberate through their very souls. "You cannot stop me," the creature taunted. "The land is mine. It always has been." Jake clenched his fists. Not anymore. As they neared the base of the gnarled tree, they could see the roots stretching deep into the earth, each one pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to feed the creature's form. The air around them crackled, and the ground beneath their feet shifted, the very soil groaning in protest as if trying to push them away. Daniel knelt beside one of the roots, his hands trembling slightly as he traced the markings on its surface. These symbols, they're ancient. They're not just here to seal it. They're binding it to the land, to the heart. If we can disrupt the connection, if we can break the seal. His voice trailed off as he realized the enormity of what needed to be done. Jake glanced at Claire. "Can you do it? Can you break the seal?" She nodded, her face grim but determined. I'll try. With a steady breath, Claire reached out and placed her hands on the root, her fingers tracing the symbols etched deep into its surface. The moment her skin made contact, the ground trembled violently, and a surge of dark energy shot through her. She gasped, her body locking in place as the force of the connection struck her like a bolt of lightning. No! The creature's voice shrieked, a sound that split the air, filled with rage. You cannot undo what has been done. The heart is mine. But Claire refused to pull away. Her grip tightened, and with a quiet prayer, she focused on the connection between the root and the heart of the forest. She could feel the ancient power thrumming beneath her palms, a vast, oppressive force that sought to drown her. But she held fast, pushing through the darkness with the strength of the forest that had become a part of her. Jake and Daniel stood back, watching in awe and fear as the energy around Claire intensified. The creature writhed in the clearing, its tendrils reaching toward her, but it was too late. The connection was weakening. With a final, desperate surge, Claire pulled her hands back, breaking the connection. The air around them exploded with energy, and the ground cracked open as if in protest. The creature's form screamed, a sound that shook the very earth, but the power that had bound it to the land began to fracture. The glowing markings on the roots began to fade, their dark energy dissipating into the air like smoke. The creature faltered, its form flickering and destabilizing. You, it whispered, its voice weak and filled with disbelief. You've destroyed it. Jake stepped forward, his eyes hard. It's over. You won't control the land anymore. And with that, the creature's form shattered into a cloud of darkness, vanishing into the air like dust caught in the wind. The clearing was silent, the oppressive weight that had filled the air lifting as the energy of the forest slowly began to settle. The land was still. The mist began to clear, and the trees around them slowly ceased their groaning, their roots settling back into the earth. The forest, which had once been under the creature's control, was free again. But Jake, Claire, and Daniel knew that the true battle had only just begun. The forest was free, but they had to rebuild. They had to ensure that the heart would remain strong, that nothing would threaten it again. They had defeated the darkness, but the land had been scarred, and healing would take time. As they stood together in the now quiet clearing, the heartbeat of the forest pulsing faintly beneath them, they knew one thing for certain. The forest would endure, and so would they. The forest was still, its pulse steady, but it was not without its scars. The battle with the ancient creature had left a mark on the land, deep, indelible, and raw. The trees that had once been vibrant now stood silent, their leaves heavy with the weight of the struggle. The ground itself seemed to be breathing, a rhythm of life and death intertwined, the earth healing but not yet whole. Jake, Claire, and Daniel stood together in the clearing where the battle had raged. The creature was gone, its dark form reduced to nothing more than a memory, a lingering shadow that had once gripped the land in fear. But now, with its departure, the forest seemed to be exhaling, a deep, long breath that carried with it both relief and sorrow. The forest had fought hard to survive, and so had they. The first few days after the battle had been a time of silence. No one spoke much. There was a quiet reverence for the forest, for the land that had endured so much. It was as if the trees themselves were mourning, their roots still intertwined with the lingering presence of the creature, while their branches began to reach out again, seeking light, seeking life. Jake had spent the early hours after the battle kneeling in the dirt, his hands pressed into the soil, feeling the life that still remained, the deep pulse of the forest that had never fully left, even when the creature's corruption had spread. He had been close to the heart of the forest, and now, even after the battle, the heartbeat of the earth was slow but steady beneath him. It was like the land was healing, regenerating, but it needed time. Time to rest, to regain its strength, and to learn how to grow once more without the shadow that had gripped it for so long. You can feel it, can't you? Claire had asked one evening, her voice soft, barely a whisper beneath the canopy of trees. She had approached him quietly, watching him as he sat there, his hands still pressed into the earth, as if waiting for something to stir. Jake nodded without lifting his head. The heart is still here. It's weak, but it's alive. The forest it's breathing again. It will take time, but it's starting to recover. Claire crouched beside him, her fingers grazing the earth. We have to help it. We can't just leave it like this. Jake finally raised his head, his eyes tired but determined. No, we have to make sure it doesn't fall back into darkness. We can't afford to be complacent. We've done this once, but the forest is fragile now. We need to nurture it, protect it. We need to be vigilant. Daniel had joined them soon after, standing silently for a moment before speaking. The land needs us, but it also needs to be given space to heal. If we push it too hard, we risk breaking something. We have to find the balance, help it grow, but not force it. They had spent the following days doing just that, walking the land, mapping out the areas that had been most affected by the creature's corruption. They found spots where the trees were stunted, where the roots had become entangled and choked with twisted tendrils that had once been the creature's influence. The soil in some places was still tainted, its richness sapped by the darkness that had taken root. It was slow work. In some areas, they could feel the pulse of the forest strong, a deep, unshakable beat that filled the air with promise. In other places, the land seemed hollow, empty, as if waiting for something to restore its vitality. Claire took to the saplings, the young trees that had been planted in the wake of the creature's destruction. Some had already grown tall, their trunks thickening, their leaves a rich green. Others had struggled to find their footing, their growth stunted by the lingering energy of the forest's wounds. She spent hours each day tending to them, her hands brushing gently over their leaves, offering quiet words of encouragement. There was something about these young trees that called to her, something that felt connected to her own spirit. She had nurtured them through their infancy, and she would continue to care for them until they were strong enough to stand on their own. Jake, meanwhile, had returned to the heart of the forest, the tree that had once been the center of the creature's power. He had spent countless hours there in the early days, but now, with the battle behind them, he returned to find the tree struggling to regain its former glory. Its bark was still scarred, its branches twisted and weak. But the pulse of the forest still thrummed beneath it, faint but present. He placed his hands on the gnarled trunk, his fingers brushing over the deep grooves that ran through its surface, like scars from a time long past. "We're not done," Jake whispered to the tree. "We'll fix this. We'll help you heal." The process of healing was slow but steady. The three of them worked tirelessly, each finding their place in the restoration of the land. But there were moments when the land seemed to speak to them in ways they couldn't fully understand. The whispers of the wind through the trees, the low groan of the earth beneath their feet, the sudden stillness that fell over the forest at twilight. There was something deep in the forest's soul that was still recovering, something that was waiting. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by a fire in the clearing. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth mixing with the smoke of the campfire. The stars overhead shone brightly, and the sky was clear, an endless stretch of dark blue. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the night air, but there was a quiet tension in the stillness of the forest. The creatures had returned, but they were different. The forest was different. There was a balance now, a sense of fragile harmony that felt both comforting and uncertain. "We've done everything we can," Claire said quietly, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "But it feels like we're still missing something." Jake turned his head to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "I feel it too. There's something in the land that's still unsettled. The forest, it's not ready to be left alone just yet. We have to stay connected to it, to the heart." Daniel leaned forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the firelight. "There's more to this place than we know, more than we've uncovered. I think we've only just scratched the surface of what this land has to offer, or what it's hiding." Jake nodded slowly. "We've been working with the forest, but we've never really understood it completely. Maybe there's more that we can learn, more that we need to do." They sat in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the stillness. The forest around them was alive with quiet movement, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But beneath it all, Jake could feel the faint pulse of the heart of the forest, still beating, still striving to heal. It was a rhythm he had come to know well over the past few years, but now it was quieter, more fragile. "There's a balance here," Jake said softly, more to himself than to the others. "The forest has been wounded, but it's not gone. The heart may be broken, but it's still beating. And as long as we're here, we'll keep helping it grow." They sat together by the fire, the weight of their thoughts settling over them. The battle was over, but the work was far from finished. The forest had given them everything, its life, its secrets, and its power, but it had also taken something in return. They had fought, they had struggled, but the forest had endured. And now it was their turn to help it endure. Together they would continue to protect it, nurture it, and rebuild it. They would find the answers they were still searching for, and in time, they would unlock the true heart of the forest, the heart that had once been corrupted, but was now poised for rebirth. The fire crackled, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was theirs to shape. The forest was alive, and so were they. Together they would face whatever came next. As the days stretched into weeks, the forest continued to evolve, slowly and steadily, but with an unmistakable sense of quiet anticipation. Jake, Claire, and Daniel found themselves drawn deeper into the heart of the land, unable to ignore the pull that seemed to radiate from the earth itself. Every step they took in the woods was filled with a kind of reverence, an unspoken understanding that the land was still healing, still holding on to secrets, and still waiting for something more. The forest was a living entity, one that had endured both the torment of the creature's corruption and the long process of restoration. It had changed, grown stronger in some places, weaker in others, but its heartbeat, faint and steady, remained constant. Jake had always felt that pulse beneath his feet, the subtle thrum of life that permeated every corner of the forest. But now it was different. It was softer, almost like a sigh, as though the forest was breathing in slow, deep breaths, still recovering from the weight it had carried for so long. They had worked hard to restore the land, but each of them felt the same nagging sense that there was still something they had yet to uncover. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered in the very soil beneath their feet. The land had been tainted, and the scars would take time to fade. But more than that, there was something old, something buried deep within the earth that still called to them. Jake had always believed that the forest had a soul, that it was connected to something ancient and far beyond their understanding. But now, as he spent more time in the woods, he began to feel that connection more keenly. It was as though the land was speaking to him, calling to him in a way that he couldn't quite explain. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Jake wandered off alone. He had been having vivid dreams of the forest's heart, dreams of a place deep underground, where roots and stone met in an ancient, silent meeting. He wasn't sure why these dreams were so vivid, so real, but he felt compelled to follow them, to see where they led. The forest around him was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The air had taken on that sweet, earthy scent of rain-soaked earth and moss, and the world felt heavy with anticipation, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Jake walked through the familiar paths he had taken countless times before, but today, everything felt different. The trees stood taller, their branches thicker, their leaves more vibrant, as if the land was reaching toward something, stretching to touch an unknown horizon. The ground beneath his boots felt softer, warmer, as if it were alive with energy. He moved through the underbrush, his hands brushing against the trees as he passed, each touch sending a faint ripple of energy through the air. The land was awake, alive, aware, and it was pulling him deeper into its embrace. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jake found himself standing at the base of an ancient oak, one of the oldest trees in the forest. Its trunk was massive, gnarled with age, and its roots spread out like the fingers of a giant hand, twisting into the earth as though reaching for something below. He had never noticed this tree before, not in the way he was seeing it now. It stood in the heart of a clearing, its shadow long and stretching across the ground. The air around it was thick with energy, the kind of energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Jake could feel it then, the pulse of the land, the heartbeat of the forest, but stronger now, more urgent. It was coming from beneath the oak, deep within the earth. The tree was alive with power, and Jake knew without a doubt that this was the place he had been searching for. He kneeled beside the roots, pressing his palm to the ground, feeling the warmth radiating from below. The pulse was steady, but it was faint, like the last beat of a heart just before it fades. His breath quickened as he pressed harder, his mind focused on the sensation of the earth beneath him, the connection to the heartbeat that had been guiding him for so long. For a moment, everything went silent. The breeze stopped. The rustling of leaves ceased. Even the birds stopped singing. It was as if the forest had paused, holding its breath in the face of what was about to happen. Jake closed his eyes, his fingers digging into the roots, his mind focused entirely on the pulse beneath him. It was stronger now, vibrating through his fingertips, and in that moment he felt something shift within the earth. A deep, ancient force stirred beneath the surface, like a door opening after centuries of silence. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind, low and resonant, the words not spoken aloud but felt in the depths of his being. "You have come. The time is near." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The voice was not a human voice, nor was it the voice of the creature. It was something older, something tied to the very fabric of the land. It was the voice of the forest itself. "You seek to understand. You seek to heal. But the forest is not only a place of life. It is a place of death, of memory, and the past will never be forgotten." The voice was not threatening, but it was filled with an ancient sorrow, as if the forest carried a weight that none of them could fully understand. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the pulse, stronger now, almost overwhelming. It was as though the earth itself was speaking, urging him to listen, to understand. You have restored what was broken, but not all wounds heal. Not all scars fade. The creature you fought was only one of many that have come before. Jake's hands trembled as he pressed them into the earth. He didn't know what to say, what to ask. The forest was alive with something ancient, something that had seen countless cycles of life and death. The heart of the forest is not simply the land, the voice continued. It is the memory of all that has come before. It is the pulse of time itself. And you who have touched it will soon understand that your battle was only one in a long line. There is more, much more, that lies ahead. Jake's mind swirled with the implications of the voice's words. He had always known the forest was ancient, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The forest wasn't just a place of healing, it was a living memory, a place where the past lingered, where every event, every moment, was stored in the very soil beneath their feet. The voice fell silent, leaving Jake with the overwhelming sense that he had only begun to scratch the surface of what the forest truly was. For a long time, he knelt there, his hand pressed into the roots, feeling the pulse of the land beneath him. Slowly, the energy began to fade, the silence returning to the forest. The breeze started again, the leaves rustling softly, and the birds resumed their songs. But Jake knew that nothing would ever be the same. He stood up, his mind racing, his body trembling from the intensity of the experience. He didn't know what the future held, but he understood now that the forest was not just a place to protect. There was something deeper, something more mysterious. And his role, was far from over. As Jake made his way back to the camp where Claire and Daniel waited, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of purple and gold. The forest, still and quiet, surrounded him like a living entity, its heartbeat steady but full of secrets. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but one thing was clear. The forest was more than just a place. It was a story, an eternal one, and their place in it had only just begun. The days following Jake's encounter with the voice of the forest were filled with a quiet urgency. The forest, once a mere landscape to be explored and protected, now felt like something deeper, something ancient that had been lying dormant beneath the surface. There was a sense of power that lingered in the air, but it was tempered by a kind of unease, an unspoken understanding that they had only just begun to uncover the forest's true nature. The forest was more than just a home, it was a memory keeper, a sentinel of ancient times, and Jake had become part of its story whether he was ready or not. Claire and Daniel had noticed the shift in Jake after that day. He was more focused, quieter at times, his thoughts seemingly far away. It wasn't just the weight of their ongoing mission to restore the land, it was the sense that something larger was at play, something they hadn't fully grasped yet. But neither of them asked what had happened during his time alone in the woods. There were no words to express what he had felt, no way to explain the voice that had spoken to him in the stillness of the earth. And Jake wasn't sure he had the answers either. The mornings began to stretch out longer, the sun rising higher in the sky, casting light on the soft mist that clung to the forest floor. The forest was healing, yes, but it was still fragile, still waking from the long nightmare it had endured. But every morning, when Jake stood in the clearing with Claire and Daniel, he could feel the pulse beneath his feet, faint but insistent, calling to him, urging him to listen. That evening, as they sat around the campfire, the firelight casting long shadows across their faces, Jake shared what had happened to him that day. "I've been feeling something," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "Something beneath the earth. I went out into the woods again. I felt like I was being pulled somewhere. And I found it, this old oak in the heart of the forest. It was like nothing I've ever felt before." Claire tilted her head, her gaze curious. "What do you mean? Was it the pulse you've been feeling?" Jake nodded, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his cup. "It's like the forest's heartbeat. But this time it felt different, stronger. I could hear it in my mind, almost like the forest was speaking to me." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Spoken to you? What did it say?" Jake took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. "It said we had come, that the time was near. And then it told me something else, that the battle we fought against the creature, that it was just one of many, that the forest is a keeper of memories, of time. The creature wasn't the first, and it won't be the last." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks into the cool night air. There was a long silence before Claire spoke. "I've always known the forest was ancient, but to hear that, it makes sense in a way. It's always been a part of the land, of the world. It's seen things we could never imagine." "Yeah," Jake replied, his voice distant. "And I think we've only scratched the surface of what this place really is." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. What if there's something more out there? Something that ties everything together? The creatures, the land, the forest itself. A force that's been keeping everything in check. Jake nodded slowly, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. That's what I'm afraid of. The creature was just one manifestation. It wasn't the beginning, and it won't be the end. Claire's gaze shifted to the trees surrounding their camp, her expression thoughtful. There's something else though. Something we're missing. If the forest is a memory keeper, then that means it's holding on to something important. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the crackle of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest filling the quiet. Finally Jake spoke. I need to go back. To the oak tree. There's something there, something beneath it. I can feel it. Claire stood up, her eyes locking with Jake's. We'll go with you. Whatever it is, we face it together. Daniel nodded. If it's tied to the heart of the forest, we need to understand it. We can't keep guessing. They made their way back to the clearing the next morning, the air crisp and filled with the scent of fresh pine and damp earth. The journey felt different now. They weren't just walking through the woods anymore, they were walking through something ancient, something that held the secrets of the world in its roots and branches. Every step seemed to carry them further from the familiar and deeper into the unknown. As they approached the oak tree, the ground beneath their feet felt different, softer and warmer, as if the earth itself was alive and waiting. The tree stood there, gnarled and ancient, its twisted roots crawling deep into the earth like veins beneath the skin of the world. There was a strange hum in the air now, an energy that seemed to vibrate through the air, making the leaves tremble with anticipation. Jake knelt beside the tree, his fingers brushing the bark. There was a connection here, something deeper than he had realized before. The roots beneath him thrummed with power, and the earth seemed to breathe beneath his touch. Help me, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with a sense of urgency. Please. For a moment there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind through the branches and the distant call of birds. But then, slowly, the earth began to shift beneath him. The ground trembled just a little, and the roots of the oak tree seemed to stir, twisting and turning as though they were waking from a long slumber. And then it happened. The ground cracked open beneath the tree, a deep fissure appearing as if the earth was opening its mouth to reveal a secret hidden deep beneath. A soft glow emanated from the crack, a pale, ghostly light that seemed to pulse with life. The air around them grew colder, and the sound of the earth shifting intensified, like the groaning of a vast, ancient creature. Jake reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it against the crack in the ground. The glow pulsed brighter, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. You have awakened the heart, the voice from before echoed in his mind, its tone calm but filled with an undeniable weight. The forest has been waiting. The time has come to remember. The crack in the earth widened, revealing a small chamber beneath the roots of the tree. Inside, glowing symbols, ancient and unfamiliar, lined the walls, their light flickering like stars. It was a place of power, a place where time itself seemed to converge, where the past, present, and future met in an endless dance. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the heart of the forest, the source of its memory, the place where the stories of the land were kept. The air hummed with energy, and Jake stepped forward, feeling the weight of history pressing against him. He could feel the presence of something vast beneath the earth, something older than the forest itself. It was the pulse of the land, the heartbeat of the earth, and it was calling to him. Are we ready for this? Claire asked softly, her voice filled with awe and trepidation. Jake turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the light of the glowing symbols. We have to be. Together, they stepped into the chamber, the crack in the earth closing behind them. The forest, silent and still above, waited. The heartbeat of the land, stronger than ever, pulsed beneath their feet, and in that moment, they knew that their journey was far from over. The forest had awakened, but its true story, its real history, was just beginning to unfold. The chamber beneath the oak tree was unlike anything Jake, Claire, and Daniel had ever encountered. The walls were smooth stone, yet they pulsed with energy as if the very earth itself was alive, breathing, waiting for them. The light that emanated from the glowing symbols seemed to shift and change with every breath they took, casting flickering shadows that danced along the walls. It was a place that felt both ancient and timeless, as though it had been here long before any of them had been born, and would remain long after they were gone. Jake's fingers grazed the cool stone as he stepped further into the chamber, the symbols casting faint reflections on the surfaces of his hands. There was something almost hypnotic about the way the light moved, swirling like liquid fire beneath his touch. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving forward, to uncover what was hidden in the depths of this forgotten place. As the group ventured deeper, the chamber opened up, revealing an enormous circular space at its heart. At the center, suspended in midair, was a large, translucent orb, its surface shimmering with an ethereal light, like a second moon glowing in the heart of the earth. The orb pulsed with the same rhythm that had guided them here, the heartbeat of the forest, the pulse of memory. It was as if the entire land had gathered itself in this single object, storing everything that had ever been. Jake stood frozen for a moment, the enormity of the discovery settling over him like a blanket. He had known that the forest was ancient, that it held secrets older than anything they could comprehend. But this was something else entirely. This was the heart, the core of all that had happened, of all that had been and would be. "This is it," Claire whispered, her voice reverent as she stepped closer. "The heart of the forest. It's like a living memory." Jake nodded, his mind struggling to wrap around the concept. It wasn't just a source of power. It wasn't just a physical object. It was a repository of everything the forest had ever experienced. Its joys, its pain, its history. The creatures that had lived here, the battles fought, the cycles of life and death. It was all contained in this orb, stored in the very heart of the earth. But there was something else, something deeper in the way the orb pulsed. It wasn't just holding memories. It was also guiding them. And Jake couldn't help but feel that they had been chosen to witness this moment, to become part of this story. "The forest isn't just alive," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's remembering." Daniel, who had been staring at the orb with an intensity that bordered on reverence, finally spoke. "It's more than that. The forest is trying to teach us something. It's been holding on to this knowledge for so long, waiting for us to be ready." Jake stepped closer to the orb, the air around it growing thicker, heavier. The pulse intensified, vibrating through his chest as though it were calling to him, reaching out to touch him, to share its secrets. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the collective memory of the forest flooding his mind. Suddenly the orb began to shift. The light that had been pulsing gently now flared brightly, casting long shadows across the walls of the chamber. The air hummed with a power so intense that it felt like the ground beneath their feet might crack open. A low rumbling sound echoed from the orb, deep and resonant, as if it were speaking in a language that Jake couldn't understand. But somehow he knew that it was a language of the earth, of ancient things. And then the voice spoke again, not in their minds this time, but aloud, its tone rich and deep, reverberating through the very stones of the chamber. "You have come. You have awakened what was once lost. The heart of the forest has spoken, and you have answered. But now you must understand what it has shown you." Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was not the same as the one he had heard in his mind before. It was far older, far more powerful. It was the voice of the forest itself, or perhaps of something that had lived long before the forest had taken its current form. The orb's light shifted again, this time forming intricate patterns in the air. Images, scenes, glimpses of the past. The first image that appeared was one of the forest in its prime. Towering trees that seemed to stretch into the heavens, their branches thick with leaves that shimmered in the sunlight. The creatures of the land, large and small, roamed freely beneath the canopy, and the air was filled with the hum of life. It was a place of peace, of balance. But then the images began to change. The trees grew thin and twisted, their leaves wilting and falling away. The creatures that once roamed freely were now corrupted, their forms dark and twisted. The land itself seemed to decay, the earth becoming barren and cracked. A storm of dark energy raged across the skies, the winds howling as if they were alive. And from the depths of the storm, a shadow rose, a shape that was more shadow than substance, a being of pure darkness that fed on the land's pain. "This is the beginning," the voice intoned, its words echoing in the chamber. "The forest remembers the fall of the ancient guardians, the ones who once protected this place. And from their death, a new darkness arose, one that sought to consume the forest, to break its bond with the world." Jake could feel the power of the images wash over him, the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. This wasn't just a memory. This was a warning. A warning that the forest's peace had been shattered before, and that darkness had once again begun to creep back into the land. The next image that appeared was one of the creature they had fought, the same shadow that had been released when the seals were broken. It was more than a creature. It was a manifestation of the forest's deepest wounds, a being of pure malice and hunger. The image flickered, shifting between the creature's twisted form and the face of an ancient being. A guardian, perhaps, but one long lost to time. The guardians fell, the voice continued. The bond between the forest and the world weakened, and the darkness returned. It took root, spreading its corruption through the land. But the heart, this heart, was never lost. It waits. It holds the memories, the power to restore balance. The images shifted again, this time showing a group of figures, people who stood at the edge of the forest, staring out at the land. They were cloaked in shadows, their faces hidden, but there was an unmistakable sense of purpose in their stance. They were protectors, watchers, keepers of the forest's deepest secrets. The guardians are not gone, the voice said, almost sorrowful. They have only been forgotten. You are their heirs. You are the ones who must restore what was broken. The forest has chosen you to protect it, but you must understand, this will not be easy. The darkness is already stirring again. It will come for what you protect, and you must be ready. The chamber grew colder as the final image flashed across the orb, an image of the forest as it was now. The trees still stood tall, but their branches were heavy with the scars of past battles. The creatures, though still wild, were cautious, aware of the dark forces that lingered. And the land, though healing, was fragile, still haunted by the memory of the creatures that had once sought to destroy it. The forest will always need its guardians, but you too will need allies. The path ahead is long and fraught with danger, but you are not alone. The forest will guide you. With that, the orb's light began to fade, the images vanishing into the ether as quickly as they had appeared. The room returned to its quiet stillness, the only sound the soft echo of their breaths. Jake stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of what they had just learned pressed heavily upon him, but it wasn't fear that lingered, it was a sense of purpose. They had come here seeking answers, but what they had found was a new understanding. The forest wasn't just a place to be saved, it was a living, breathing entity with a history that reached far beyond what they had imagined. It was waiting for them to step into its story, to take their place as its protectors. Claire and Daniel stood beside him, equally silent, as if absorbing the weight of the revelations. There was a bond between them now, a shared understanding that their journey had only just begun. The darkness is coming, Jake whispered, his voice steady, and we're ready. The weight of the forest's revelation settled heavily on Jake, Claire, and Daniel. The orb had shown them fragments of the past, warning them of a darkness that had once consumed the land, and was now stirring once more. The memories of the guardians, long thought lost, had been brought to the surface, urging them to step into roles they had never expected. But with that call to protect the forest, a deeper understanding had begun to take root in each of them. They weren't merely caretakers of the land, they were inheritors of an ancient legacy. As they stood in the heart of the chamber beneath the oak tree, the air still thick with the pulse of the forest's power, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The forest around them, once serene and healing, now felt on edge, as though the trees themselves were waiting for the first stirrings of a storm. And Jake knew, deep in his bones, that the darkness the orb had shown them was not a distant threat. It was here, closer than they realized, creeping through the shadows of the world. The orb's final words echoed in Jake's mind as they made their way back up to the clearing. The path ahead is long and fraught with danger, but you are not alone. The forest will guide you. There was truth in those words, but there was also a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. Whatever was coming, it was already moving through the world, weaving itself into the fabric of the land like a dark thread, unseen but powerful. The sun had long set by the time they returned to their camp. The fire crackled softly, but the air around it felt thick, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The distant sound of rustling leaves and the occasional call of an owl filled the silence, but there was no mistaking the tension that had settled over the forest. Something was coming, and it would not be stopped by the strength of any one person. It would require the collective effort of those who cared for the forest, those who had been chosen to guard it. We need to prepare, Claire said, her voice low but steady. She sat by the fire, her hands pressed together as if seeking warmth from the flames. The forest has shown us what's coming, and it's not just going to fade away. We have to act. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. We have to find the other guardians. If we're going to stand against this darkness, we need to know who we're up against, and what we can do. Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. But where do we start? The guardians are ancient. They've been gone for centuries. How do we find them? Claire's voice was thoughtful. The forest will guide us. The orb said so. Maybe we need to listen more closely. There's more to this place than we understand. We've seen the past, but we don't know everything yet. The night stretched on, the weight of their conversation pressing on their shoulders. As the fire slowly dwindled down to embers, Jake stood up, the need for action pulling at him. Tomorrow we begin searching. The forest is vast, but we felt the pulse. It's stronger in some places than others. If the guardians are still out there, we'll find them. Claire and Daniel nodded, rising to join him. The next steps were unclear, but they knew they had no choice but to take them. The forest had chosen them, and now they had to live up to that calling. They couldn't afford to hesitate. The following morning, the trio set out at first light. The mist hung thick in the forest, the air cool and damp from the overnight rain. The ground beneath their feet was soft, the earthy scent of the forest filling their lungs as they walked. The trees towered above them, their branches thick with leaves, but there was an odd stillness in the air. Even the animals were quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Their journey led them deeper into the woods, to places they had never ventured before. The land felt different now, as though the veil between the past and present had thinned. Every step they took was filled with a sense of both discovery and foreboding. It was as if the forest itself was opening up to them, revealing its hidden secrets, secrets it had kept for centuries. As they moved through the dense underbrush, Claire reached up to touch a tree's gnarled bark, her fingers tracing the rough texture. "There's something here," she said quietly. "The pulse, it's stronger in this area. It feels like we're close." Jake stopped, feeling the ground beneath his feet shift. The air felt charged with energy, the pulse in the earth growing stronger. It was a familiar sensation now, a heartbeat that was both comforting and unsettling. He turned to face his companions. "We're close," he agreed, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay alert." They continued forward, the forest thickening as they moved deeper into its heart. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches interwoven like the fingers of ancient hands, their trunks scarred with time. The silence around them deepened, the only sound the occasional snap of a twig beneath their feet. Then they came upon a clearing, a small hidden grove tucked away from the world. The air here was different. It was thick with power, but also with something else, something ancient. In the center of the grove stood a massive stone structure, half hidden by the overgrown foliage. The stones were covered in ivy, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of weathering. But there was no mistaking it. The structure was a monument, a temple of some kind, and it was older than anything they had ever seen. Jake felt the pulse of the forest surge in his chest, more powerful than ever. This was it. The guardians had been here. "I knew it," Claire whispered, stepping forward. "This place, it's a sanctuary. A place where the guardians once gathered." Daniel moved cautiously toward the structure, his eyes scanning the stonework. It's a temple, but who built it? And why was it hidden away like this?" Jake stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch the stone. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, a sudden tremor ran through the ground, and a soft, eerie glow began to emanate from the cracks in the stone. "You have found it." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, its deep resonance vibrating through the air like a distant thunderstorm. The words were not spoken aloud, but Jake felt them in his bones. He stepped back, his heart pounding as the ground beneath them shifted. A crack formed in the center of the stone structure, and from the darkness within, a figure emerged, a tall, shadowed being, its form barely visible in the dim light. The figure moved toward them with deliberate steps, its presence commanding yet tranquil, as if it had been waiting for centuries to be found. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was one of the guardians. It had to be. The figure stopped before them, its eyes gleaming with an ancient wisdom, the faintest glimmer of recognition in its gaze. "You have come to seek answers," the voice echoed again, now filled with quiet strength. "And you have found the first step. But the journey ahead will not be easy. Darkness has already begun to stir." Jake swallowed hard, his voice steady but filled with awe. "Who are you?" "I am one who once stood as a guardian," the figure replied. "I am the first of many who will rise again. But the darkness is coming, and you must be ready. Together we will protect this land." The air around them seemed to hum with energy, the forest holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The figure before them remained still, its presence like an ancient mountain, steady and unyielding. Despite its ethereal form, it radiated power, an energy that was palpable in the air, charged with centuries of history and purpose. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the twilight, a quiet fire of knowledge and strength. It was the first of the guardians, the one who had remained hidden in the depths of the forest for eons, waiting for those who would answer the call. Jake, Claire, and Daniel stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing on them. They had come here seeking answers, and now they stood in the presence of the past. The guardian's voice had echoed through their minds, its words calm yet filled with an undeniable urgency. Darkness has already begun to stir. For a long moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The wind had stopped, the birds had ceased their calls, and the forest itself seemed to pause as if waiting for the next step. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice steady but filled with awe. "You're a guardian," he said, his eyes never leaving the figure. "A protector of the forest. Why did you hide? Why did the others vanish?" The figure's eyes softened, a hint of sadness flickering in its gaze. "We did not vanish," it said, its voice like the rustle of leaves in a quiet breeze. "We were removed. The forest is not just a place of life, it is a place of balance, a place where all things are connected. The guardians are the keepers of that balance. But when the darkness began to rise, when the land was corrupted, the bond between the guardians and the forest was severed. We were forced to retreat to wait for the land to heal." Claire stepped forward, her eyes wide with both curiosity and concern. "And now the forest is healing. But the darkness is coming again? What happened? What is this darkness you speak of?" The guardian's gaze grew more intense, its form flickering slightly, as if it were drawing on the power of the forest itself. "The darkness is not a single creature, nor a single force," it explained. "It is a manifestation of all that is wrong in the world, of every broken thing, every corrupted soul, every scar left upon the earth. It feeds on pain, on fear, on decay. It is an ancient thing older than the forest itself, and it seeks to consume all that is pure. It has risen before, and it will rise again, until all that remains is darkness." Jake could feel the weight of those words in his chest, the heaviness of them pressing down on him. This wasn't just a battle between good and evil, it was a battle for the very essence of the world. The forest, the guardians, and everything they had fought for were in danger. "And we," Jake began slowly, "were the ones who have to stop it?" The guardian nodded, its form shimmering like a reflection in water. "Yes. The darkness will come for the heart of the forest, the source of its power. It will twist the land, turn the forest against itself, and feed on the very memories that hold this world together. You, the heirs of the guardians, must stop it. But you cannot do it alone." Daniel stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Who else is out there?" The guardian's gaze shifted, as if it were looking far beyond the grove, deep into the heart of the forest. "There are others," it said. "Others like you. Others who still carry the blood of the guardians within them. They are scattered, hidden in places both near and far, and they too must be called. You must seek them out, bring them together. Only then will you have a chance to stand against the darkness." Jake's mind raced, trying to comprehend the enormity of what the guardian was asking. They weren't just fighting for the forest. They were fighting for the entire world, for the very balance of life and death. And the guardians weren't just ancient protectors. They were part of something larger, something that spanned centuries of history. "Where do we find them?" Claire asked, her voice tinged with determination. "How do we know who they are?" The guardian's eyes met hers, the ancient wisdom in its gaze unwavering. "The forest will guide you. It always has. The pulse you feel, the heartbeat beneath the earth, that is the land calling to you, showing you the way. But be warned, the path will not be easy. The darkness is already on the move, and it will seek to destroy you before you can unite the guardians. Time is short." Jake's gaze drifted back to the glowing stone monument, the symbols etched into the surface of the stone still pulsing with faint light. The forest was more than just a place. It was a living memory, and it was calling them to take their place in the story. They were the heirs of the guardians, and the forest's heart was beating within them, urging them to act. "Then we start now," Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. He turned to his companions, his eyes meeting theirs. "We find the others, we bring them together, and we prepare for what's coming." The guardian nodded, its form shifting as if it were fading into the very air around them. "Remember this," it said, its voice a whisper on the wind. "The forest has always been more than just trees and earth. It is a memory, a story, and it has always been told by those who walk its paths. You are the next chapter." With those final words, the guardian's form flickered and vanished into the air, leaving only the lingering echo of its voice in their minds. The air in the grove grew still, the energy that had filled the space now receding into the earth, but the pulse of the forest, stronger than ever, remained. It was as if the land itself was waiting for them to move, to take the next step in the battle against the darkness. Jake stood in the center of the grove, the weight of the task ahead pressing on him. He knew that the journey would not be easy. There would be trials, battles, and hardships along the way. But one thing was certain, they were not alone. The forest was with them. And together they would face whatever the darkness had in store. "Let's go," Jake said, turning to face Claire and Daniel. "We have work to do." The three of them left the grove behind, their steps sure and steady, the forest seeming to part for them as they walked. The trees whispered around them, their leaves rustling softly in the wind as if they too were urging them forward. The path ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. The battle for the forest had begun and they were ready to face it. As they made their way deeper into the woods, the air thick with anticipation, they could feel the weight of their new purpose settle into their bones. The guardians had risen. The darkness was stirring, and the forest was waiting for them to take their place in its story. The forest seemed different now, as if it had opened its arms to embrace them. The air was thick with the pulse of life, but beneath it, there was an undercurrent of something else, something darker. Jake, Claire, and Daniel moved with purpose, their steps light but deliberate, the weight of their mission pressing on them like an invisible force. The first guardian had told them what they needed to do. They had to find the other guardians, the scattered heirs, before the darkness consumed the world. But even with the forest guiding them, the task seemed insurmountable. The path ahead was unclear, but the forest itself seemed to whisper, as if it were leading them toward something just beyond their reach. Every step they took, the pulse grew stronger, as though the land itself was pulling them toward the heart of its mystery. And yet, with every step, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the trees, grew stronger. "You feel that?" Claire asked, her voice barely more than a murmur. Jake nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of the blade at his side. The air was thick with the sense that they weren't alone, but every time they turned to look, there was nothing there. Only the trees, their ancient limbs creaking in the wind. "Something's out there," Daniel said quietly, his gaze shifting from side to side as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. Jake's instincts were on edge. The forest wasn't just calling them, it was testing them. Every shadow, every rustle in the underbrush felt like a challenge. He could feel the darkness stirring, pulling at the edges of their minds, feeding on their fears. They walked in silence for a while, the weight of their thoughts filling the spaces between them. There was no easy way forward. The guardian had said the path would not be easy, and already, they could feel the truth of that statement pressing in on them. Finally, they came upon a clearing. It was small, hidden away from the main path, as if it had been intentionally concealed by the forest itself. The trees were densely packed, their branches intertwining above them to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. At the center of the clearing was a stone altar, ancient and weathered by time. The stone was cracked in places, but there was no mistaking its significance. It was a place of power, a place where rituals had once been performed, where guardians had once gathered to protect the forest. Jake felt the pulse here more strongly than ever before. It was as if the heart of the forest itself was beating beneath the stone altar, calling them closer. "This is it," Jake said, his voice low. "This is where we need to be." Claire and Daniel exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. They stepped forward together, moving cautiously as if the very ground beneath them might give way. As they approached the altar, the air grew heavier. The pulse that had been steady before now throbbed in their chests, as though the land was alive, and they were at its very heart. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the stone. The moment his skin made contact, a tremor passed through him, sharp and sudden, as though the altar itself had come to life. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through their very bones. The pulse of the forest was no longer just a distant echo. It was here, at the center of everything. Jake's breath caught in his throat, his heart racing as he felt the energy surge around him. This was where it all began, where the guardians had once stood. And then, as if in answer to their presence, the forest around them shifted. The trees trembled, their branches swaying even though there was no wind. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse, alive with ancient energy. A figure stepped from the shadows of the trees, its form emerging like smoke from the darkness. It was tall, draped in tattered robes that seemed to shimmer with a faint, otherworldly light. Its face was hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking its presence. The power it radiated was undeniable. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his blade, but the figure raised a hand, halting them before they could draw their weapons. "You have come," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, like the sound of an old bell tolling. "The guardians are not forgotten, but they have been scattered. You have awakened the call." Claire stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Are you one of the guardians?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in the air. The figure tilted its head, its eyes glowing faintly from beneath the hood. "I am a keeper of the forest's memory. I am an echo of the past, a shadow of the guardians who once walked these lands. But yes, I am one of them. And I have been waiting for you. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Waiting for us? How do you know who we are? The figure's eyes gleamed, its voice softer now. The forest has whispered your names, and the pulse has guided you here. You are the heirs of the guardians. You have awakened the ancient bond between us. You are the last hope for the forest, and for all that the guardians stood for. A heavy silence fell over the group, the weight of the figure's words pressing on their shoulders. The forest had been waiting for them. It had called them here for a reason, because they were the last line of defense. But against what? Why have you been hiding? Daniel asked, his voice sharp with curiosity and frustration. Why wait until now to reveal yourself? The figure's gaze darkened, and the air around them seemed to grow colder. I did not hide. I was bound by the forest's will, bound by the ancient magic that once protected this land. When the darkness first came, I was forced to retreat, to hide away, until the land healed enough for the guardians to return. But the darkness is stirring again, and with it comes a new power, one far more dangerous than anything we faced before. The forest has awakened, and it is calling for its protectors. The time for waiting is over. Jake felt the urgency in the figure's words, and his heart quickened. The guardian's warning echoed in his mind. The darkness was coming. But they were not ready. They didn't know what they were up against. We don't know where to start, Claire said, her voice a mix of determination and frustration. We've seen the heart of the forest. We've been shown the darkness. But what do we do next? How do we fight this thing? The figure regarded her for a long moment, its gaze piercing. You must first find the others, those who still carry the blood of the guardians. They are scattered across the land, hidden in places both near and far. Some may not even know their heritage, but they will feel the pull of the forest's pulse. You must seek them out, bring them together. Only then will you have a chance to stand against the darkness. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of the task ahead. They were not alone in this fight. There were others, guardians who had yet to be awakened. But where were they? How would they find them? The forest will guide you, the figure said, its voice growing softer, almost as if it were fading into the very air around them. Trust in the pulse. Trust in the land. And remember, time is not on your side. With that, the figure turned and began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows of the trees, leaving behind only the quiet rustle of the leaves. Jake, Claire, and Daniel stood in the clearing, their minds heavy with the weight of the task ahead. The guardians were scattered. The darkness was stirring, and they were the ones chosen to unite them all. But how? The forest, ancient and alive, was calling them, and they would answer. But first they had to find the others. They had to bring the guardians back together. The forest around them seemed to change with every step, the trees growing taller, their branches thicker, as if they too were aware of the responsibility that had fallen on Jake, Claire, and Daniel. The words of the figure lingered in their minds, a constant hum beneath their thoughts. The guardians are scattered. You must seek them out, bring them together. The weight of the task pressed down on them like a storm cloud, but beneath that weight, there was a flicker of hope. They had come so far already, but now they were venturing into the unknown. The darkness was stirring and time was running out. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that flitted between the trees, made them aware of how vulnerable they truly were. The guardian they had met had warned them that the darkness wasn't a single entity, it was a force, a creeping tide that sought to consume everything in its path. And the forest, its very heart, was at risk. But the task now was clear. They had to find the others, the scattered guardians, the heirs who still carried the blood of the protectors. They had to unite them, form a circle of power strong enough to face the coming storm. The pulse, Jake murmured, glancing at Claire and Daniel. It's our guide. We have to follow it. Claire nodded, but there was an unease in her eyes. It's not just the pulse that's guiding us, Jake. It's also the forest itself. It's alive, but it's fractured. There's a scar in the land. We need to be careful. Daniel's brow furrowed. You think the darkness is already here? That it's messing with the forest? Not exactly, Claire replied, looking around cautiously. But something's off. The forest, it feels like it's holding something back. Like there's more here than we can see. Jake felt the truth of her words in his chest. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to shift. The trees, the earth beneath their feet, everything around them felt like it was watching them. Waiting. Listening. It wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a living, breathing entity that was both guiding and testing them. It was as if the land itself had its own pulse, its own heartbeat, and they were part of it. They walked for hours, the air growing thicker, heavier with each step. The pulse was undeniable, a steady thrum beneath their feet, beneath their skin, pulling them deeper into the heart of the forest. But there was something else, something darker that tugged at the edges of their senses. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching for them. And then they came to a clearing. It was quiet, unnervingly so. The wind had died, the rustle of the leaves gone. The air hung still, thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient moss. In the center of the clearing stood a stone monument, weathered and half buried by the weight of time. It was an altar, much like the one they had found before, but this one was different. There was something about it that made Jake's skin crawl, a chill in the air that didn't belong. "This place," Claire said, her voice a whisper. "It's familiar." Jake felt it too, a strange pull in the air as though something, or someone, was waiting for them. The pulse was stronger here, almost overwhelming. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the stone, but the moment his fingers brushed its surface, a wave of energy surged through him. The forest around them seemed to shift, the trees groaning as if they were alive, their limbs creaking under the strain. Suddenly the air crackled and a figure appeared before them. It was a woman, tall and regal, her features hidden by the shadow of her hood. Her cloak flowed like smoke, shifting with the wind, and her eyes gleamed with a soft, otherworldly light. She did not speak at first. Instead, she simply regarded them with an expression of quiet knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "You have come," she said at last, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves, both soothing and unsettling. "The pulse has guided you here. You have awakened the call." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "You're the last of the scattered guardians," she replied, her gaze piercing through him as if seeing straight into his soul. "I am Eliana, keeper of the forgotten path." Claire stepped forward, her brow furrowing with curiosity. "Keeper of the forgotten path? What does that mean?" Eliana's eyes shimmered as she stepped closer, the shadows of the trees seeming to part for her. "The guardians are not merely protectors of the forest. We are the keepers of its memory, the stewards of its balance. But over time, as the darkness crept into the land, we became fragmented. Some of us were lost to the earth, others to time. But all of us share a bond with the forest, and it calls us now when the balance has been shattered." Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "We've been chosen," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "The forest, it's calling us to unite the guardians." Eliana nodded. "Yes, but you must understand, this task is not one to be taken lightly. The darkness has always sought to break the balance. It will come for you for the heart of the forest, and you will need more than just the pulse to defeat it. You will need the strength of all the guardians who still remain." Claire glanced at Jake, her expression filled with concern. "But we don't even know how many guardians are left. How do we find them?" Eliana's gaze softened, a flicker of something ancient passing through her eyes. "The forest will show you the way, but it will not be easy. The path is long, and not all the guardians are ready to join the fight. Some may have forgotten who they are. Some may resist. But you must unite them all, for only then will you have the strength to stand against the darkness that is coming." Daniel's voice cut through the tension. "How do we know who to trust? How do we know who the other guardians are?" Eliana stepped back, her cloak swirling around her like a gust of wind. "The forest knows. The pulse you feel, it is the heartbeat of the world itself. It will lead you to them. Trust in it as you trust in each other. But be warned, the darkness will seek to manipulate, to turn even the purest hearts. You must remain vigilant." Jake felt the weight of her words settle on him. The task was becoming clearer now, but the burden was no lighter. They had to find the others. They had to bring them together, despite the odds, despite the darkness that sought to tear them apart. Eliana turned her gaze to the trees, her eyes distant. "I cannot go with you. My place is here with the forest. But I will guide you as much as I can. The path you walk will be difficult, but it is the only way." She reached into the folds of her cloak and withdrew a small, intricate stone pendant. It was carved with symbols that Jake couldn't quite make out, but they seemed familiar, an echo of the symbols they had seen on the monuments on the ancient trees. "Take this," she said, handing it to Claire. "It is a key, a reminder. You will know when you need it." Claire held the pendant carefully in her hand, its weight grounding her. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with determination. Eliana nodded, her form beginning to fade into the shadows of the trees. "Remember," she whispered, her voice fading like the wind, "the forest is with you. Trust in the pulse and in each other. Only then will you stand a chance." And with that, she vanished, leaving them alone in the clearing, the pulse of the forest still echoing in their hearts. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their next steps pressing down on them. They had found one guardian, but the road ahead was still unclear. They had the pendant, a key, a reminder, but what did it mean? And how would they find the others? The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to take the next step. "We need to keep moving," Jake said at last, his voice steady but resolute. "The darkness won't wait. Neither can we." With that, they turned and began walking once more, the forest guiding them, but now with a new sense of purpose, a sense that they were not alone. The pulse was still with them, and they knew they had to follow it. They had to find the others, and together they would face the coming storm. The forest was no longer just a backdrop, it was a character in their story. It breathed with them, shifting and pulsing in rhythm with their own hearts. The path forward, though unclear, seemed to be carved by something older than any of them. The pulse of the forest, strong and unwavering, beat like the heart of the world itself, leading them deeper into its vast, untamed embrace. The call of the guardians, the call to unite them, felt like a distant whisper, but it was becoming louder with every step they took. They walked for hours, the forest surrounding them like a living, breathing entity. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the forest darkening beneath the canopy of ancient trees. The shadows lengthened, twisting like specters in the corners of their vision. The pulse, though steady, now felt like a reminder of how fragile their journey was. They had a purpose, but time was slipping away. Claire clutched the pendant Eliana had given them, the small stone warm against her palm. She could feel the faint hum of energy emanating from it, but its meaning eluded her. What was the key? And how would it help them? The pendant was clearly important, it had been given to them for a reason. Yet it felt like an enigma, its purpose hidden behind layers of mystery. "Do you think the other guardians will be as hard to find?" Daniel asked, his voice low but thoughtful as they trudged through the thick underbrush. "I mean, how many of them could there possibly be?" Jake's answer was quiet, his gaze fixed ahead. "I don't know. But Eliana said they're scattered. And she was right about one thing, we're going to need them all. We can't do this alone." The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker, pressing down on them. The forest felt alive, yes, but it was also watching them, testing them. They had come here to unite the guardians, but the forest seemed to hold its secrets close. How would they find the others? Would they even be willing to join the fight? As they moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew more ancient, their trunks thick with age and their branches twisting into strange shapes. The forest felt more primal here, less forgiving. The path ahead was shrouded in mist, the edges of the trees disappearing into an impenetrable fog. And the pulse of the forest, though steady, now pulsed with an undercurrent of unease. The darkness was closer than they had thought. "We need to be careful," Claire murmured, her voice cutting through the silence. "The forest isn't just guiding us, it's also testing us. If we're not careful, we might find something we're not prepared for." Jake nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. The pulse was growing stronger now, the hum of the land vibrating beneath his feet. They were nearing something important. He could feel it. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the fog. It was a man, tall and cloaked in dark, flowing robes. His face was obscured by a hood, but the energy surrounding him was unmistakable. His presence was ancient, like the forest itself, and it carried a weight that seemed to bend the very air around him. He moved with an eerie grace, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. Jake tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon, but Claire held up a hand, signaling for caution. "Who are you?" Claire asked, her voice steady but guarded. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and resonant, filled with centuries of experience. "I am Elian, guardian of the lost paths. You have come seeking the others, but not all paths are meant to be followed." Jake's brow furrowed. "The lost paths." Elian stepped forward, his cloak swirling around him like smoke, obscuring his form in an eerie haze. "The guardians are not scattered randomly. Some have been lost to time, forgotten by the world. Others have chosen to disappear. The path you seek will not be easy. Not all of us will answer the call." Claire's grip tightened around the pendant. "Eliana said the forest would guide us. She said the pulse would lead us to the others." "The pulse is a guide," Elian replied, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "But it does not tell you everything. Some things must be discovered on your own. The forest does not reveal all its secrets to the unworthy." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And how do we prove we're worthy? How do we know you're not just another trick of the forest?" Elian's gaze met Daniel's, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "The forest will test you. and if you survive its trials, you will prove your worth. But be warned, the trials are not just physical. They will test your mind, your heart, and your soul. The darkness is not the only enemy you will face. Jake stepped forward, his voice firm. Then we're ready. We don't have a choice. We need to find the others. We need to unite the Guardians. And we need your help. Elian's gaze lingered on Jake, and for a moment, it felt as though the man could see right through him. Very well, Elian said at last, his voice carrying an air of finality. But know this, the path will not be easy. The forest will challenge you, and you will face trials that will push you to your limits. But if you are strong enough, you will find what you seek. And the darkness will not find you unprepared. With a single, deliberate motion, Elian turned and gestured for them to follow. The fog around them seemed to shift, parting as if guided by some invisible hand, revealing a narrow path leading deeper into the heart of the forest. The air grew colder as they moved forward, and the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches entwining like the fingers of 1,000 hidden hands. The pulse beneath their feet grew stronger, louder, as if the forest itself was welcoming them. But the sense of unease was still there, lurking at the edges of their thoughts. They had passed one trial, but how many more awaited them? The forest was guiding them, but what else would it require? What would they have to sacrifice to prove their worth? As they walked deeper into the mist, the shadows grew darker, stretching across the path like long fingers reaching for them. The pulse of the forest was now a rhythmic pounding in Jake's chest, matching the beat of his heart. And with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the soft, damp earth beneath them. The mist hung thick in the air, twisting and curling around them like a living thing. And still, Elian led them forward, his form moving like a shadow, barely visible through the fog. Finally, they reached a clearing, a small, quiet space, nestled deep within the heart of the forest. In the center of the clearing was an ancient stone well, its surface worn smooth by time. The air here was heavy with power, the pulse of the forest thumping like a drumbeat beneath their feet. Elian stopped at the well, his eyes flicking to the others. "This is the first trial," he said, his voice low and grave. "The well holds the memories of the guardians who have come before. To pass this trial, you must face what lies within. Only then will you be ready to continue your journey." Jake's stomach tightened. The well was ancient, its stones covered in moss and vines, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The air around it was thick with an unsettling energy. "What do we have to do?" Daniel asked, his voice taut with apprehension. Elian stepped aside, gesturing to the well. "Look into it. See the memories. Face the darkness that lies within." Jake exchanged a glance with Claire and Daniel. There was no turning back now. They had come too far. With a deep breath, Jake stepped forward, his hand resting on the edge of the well. The moment his fingers touched the stone, the air around them seemed to shift. The pulse of the forest stopped, and a cold silence fell over the clearing. The ground beneath them trembled as a deep, guttural voice echoed from the well. "The darkness is within you all. You cannot hide from it. You must face it, all of you." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. What was this? What had they awakened? The air around them shifted once again, heavy and dense, as if the very forest was holding its breath. Jake's fingers tingled as they pressed against the well's cold, weathered stone. The moment his touch made contact, the pulse of the forest, the rhythmic heartbeat that had been guiding them, ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. It was as though the world had stopped spinning, and all that remained was the space between them and the ancient well before them. "The darkness is within you all. You cannot hide from it. You must face it, all of you." The voice, deep and distorted, reverberated in the stillness, filling the space around them with a haunting presence. It wasn't a voice that came from one place. It felt as though it echoed from every corner of the forest, from the roots of the trees, from the earth beneath their feet, from the very sky above. Jake's heart raced. It was as if the well had drawn the darkness out of them, pulling it into the light, forcing them to confront the deepest parts of their souls. The voice was unsettling, filled with an ancient, almost mocking edge, as though it had been waiting for them to fail, waiting for them to stumble. And yet, despite the cold terror creeping up his spine, Jake couldn't look away from the well. It beckoned him. The trial had begun. Claire stepped closer to Jake, her eyes wide with uncertainty but also determination. What is this?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "What does it mean, the darkness is inside us?" Elian's gaze, steady and unblinking, held a quiet warning. "The well is a mirror," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the growing weight of the silence. It reflects not just your past, but your fears, your doubts. It shows you the shadows within you. To face the darkness is to face yourself, to accept the truths you've hidden. Jake felt a sudden weight in his chest, as though the very air in the clearing had thickened, pressing down on him. He wanted to step back, to escape the oppressive energy of the well, but the pull was undeniable. The pulse of the forest had stopped, replaced by a strange, hollow emptiness that filled the space between them. There was no choice now. They had to face whatever the well held or risk being lost to the forest forever. As the silence stretched, the well seemed to come alive. Its surface shimmered, its stones shifting and vibrating as if some ancient force was awakening within it. The air around them grew colder still, a chilling mist creeping up from the edges of the well. And then, as if on cue, the surface of the well began to ripple, distorting the air, twisting the space around them. Jake took a hesitant step back, his breath shallow as he watched the well. The darkness was coming. The mist began to swirl, forming shapes, shadows that flickered in and out of focus. Faces, familiar and yet distorted, appeared within the fog. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he saw his own face, twisted with fear, his eyes wide in terror. It was him, but it wasn't. The reflection of a man he didn't recognize stared back at him. He staggered back, his pulse quickening. The well, it was showing him his greatest fear. "You are weak," the voice from the well growled, its tone darker now, colder. "You will fail. The darkness is in your heart. It always has been." Jake could feel his chest tightening, a suffocating weight pressing down on him. The shadows around him deepened, warping and twisting, drawing closer with every breath. His reflection in the well seemed to mock him, its eyes filled with doubt, with failure. It was as though the very essence of who he was, his fears, his insecurities, had come to life and was staring back at him. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "Jake, don't let it get to you. It's not real. This is just the trial. It's trying to make you doubt yourself." But Jake couldn't tear his eyes away from the well. The darkness was crawling up his legs, wrapping around his chest like chains. The voice, it wasn't just a voice anymore. It was inside his mind, inside his thoughts. "You are not the hero you think you are," it whispered, cold and insidious. "You are weak. You will never succeed. You will watch the world burn and do nothing to stop it." The well's mist thickened, swirling around him, suffocating the very air in the clearing. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The reflection in the well was no longer just a distortion. It was a truth. The doubt, the fear, the sense that he wasn't enough, they were real. They had always been there, buried beneath the surface. He wanted to run, to escape, but the darkness wouldn't let him. Claire's voice broke through the fog, sharp and clear. "Jake, don't listen to it. This is just a part of the trial. You have to look past it, face yourself. This darkness, it's not real. It's just a reflection of your fear." But the darkness was growing stronger. The shadows seemed to mock her words, bending and twisting, drowning them out. Jake couldn't think, couldn't focus. The fear, the self-doubt, it was all consuming. And then, in the midst of the swirling darkness, he heard something different. A faint voice, quiet but strong, a beacon in the storm. "You are not alone." It was Claire. She was still there, still fighting for him. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't alone. He never had been. He had friends, allies, people who believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. He had the forest. He had a purpose. The darkness could show him his fears, but it couldn't define him. It couldn't take away who he was. With a forceful breath, Jake stood, pushing back against the suffocating fear. He faced the reflection in the well again, and for the first time he didn't look away. "I am not afraid," he whispered to the darkness, his voice gaining strength with every word. "I will not let you control me. I will not let you win." As if in response to his defiance, the darkness recoiled. The mist began to dissipate, the shadows pulling back into the well. The pulse of the forest returned, strong and steady, resonating with his newfound resolve. The fog lifted, and the clearing was bathed in a soft, golden light. Jake's breath slowed, his heart still pounding but no longer with fear. He had faced his darkest fears, and survived. Claire and Daniel, their faces filled with concern and relief, stepped closer. "Jake." Claire began softly, her voice trembling. "You did it. You faced it." Jake nodded, though his body still trembled with the remnants of fear. "It's not over," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "But I can face it now. We can face it." Elian stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Jake. "You have passed the first trial. he said, his voice low and filled with approval. The darkness within you has been confronted. But remember, this is only the beginning. The forest has more to show you, and there are more trials ahead. Stay vigilant. Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. The well had shown him his fears, but now he knew something crucial. The darkness could be faced, and it could be defeated. He wasn't alone. They weren't alone. The forest, once a place of uncertainty, now felt like an ally. It was testing them, yes, but it was also preparing them. They had passed the first trial, but the real journey was just beginning. Let's move on, Jake said, his voice firm. We have work to do. The others are out there, and we will find them. With that, they left the clearing behind, stepping forward into the unknown, the pulse of the forest guiding their every step. The forest felt different now. The mist had cleared, but a subtle tension lingered in the air, like the hum of something ancient, waiting to be awakened. Jake, Claire, and Daniel walked in silence, the events of the trial still fresh in their minds. The darkness within the well had been a test of their fears, a reflection of the shadows in their hearts, but now they could feel the weight of the next challenge bearing down on them. They had passed the first trial, but they knew there were more to come, each more difficult than the last. As they moved through the forest, the trees seemed to shift around them, their branches twisting and creaking in a way that felt deliberate. The pulse of the forest, once steady and familiar, now felt like a heartbeat, growing stronger as they neared something, a new presence. It was as if the forest itself was guiding them to something important, something they had to find. Elian walked ahead of them, his steps as quiet as the wind, his cloak swirling around him like smoke. He had said little since the trial, but his presence was reassuring, a steady force amidst the uncertainty. His gaze was always ahead, never wavering, and it was clear that he knew more about what lay ahead than he let on. After what felt like hours of walking, the path ahead began to narrow, the trees growing closer together, their limbs reaching out like fingers in a protective embrace. The air grew cooler, the mist returning in patches, swirling around their ankles as though beckoning them forward. Finally, they arrived at a small clearing, the ground uneven and dotted with jagged stones. At the center of the clearing stood a large tree, ancient and twisted, its gnarled roots reaching deep into the earth. The trunk was wide and thick, its bark darkened by time, yet there was an unmistakable sense of power emanating from it. Elian stopped before the tree, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "This is the place," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of knowledge. "This is where the next guardian is bound to the forest." Jake felt a shift in the air as he stepped closer to the tree. The pulse had become a constant thrum, like the beating of a heart, but now it felt different. It was deeper, more resonant, and it seemed to reach out to him, calling to him. It was as if the tree itself was alive, its ancient spirit watching, waiting. "What do we do now?" Claire asked, her voice filled with both curiosity and caution. Elian's gaze lingered on the tree, his face solemn. "The guardian of this place is not like the others. He has been here for a long time, bound to the tree, bound to the forest. To awaken him, you must connect with the essence of this place, of the forest itself. It is a bond that can only be forged through understanding, through shared strength." Daniel's brow furrowed. "How do we do that?" Elian stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward the tree's trunk. "You must open yourselves to the forest. Allow the pulse to guide you, to connect you with the ancient power of the land. Only then will you find the guardian's essence. But be warned, the bond will not be easy. We'll test you. And if you fail, the forest will reclaim what is its own." Jake took a deep breath, feeling the pulse beneath his feet, the steady rhythm that now felt like his own heartbeat. It was a strange sensation, this connection to the forest. The air seemed to hum with energy, the leaves rustling in a language he could almost understand. He closed his eyes, focusing on the pulse, allowing it to guide him. At first, there was only silence, but then, slowly, he began to feel a tug deep within the core of his being. It was a gentle pull, like the wind urging him to follow a path he couldn't see. He reached out, his fingers brushing the bark of the tree, and in that instant, the pulse surged. It wasn't just the rhythm of the forest anymore, it was something more, something ancient, something alive. The tree seemed to hum with energy, its roots stirring beneath the earth, as if recognizing his touch. Claire and Daniel stood back, watching as Jake pressed his palm against the tree, his brow furrowed in concentration. The air around them seemed to shift, the atmosphere thickening with power. And then, without warning, a voice spoke, low, deep, and resonant, echoing through the clearing. "You seek the guardian. But are you worthy to bear the bond?" The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating in the very air around them. It was ancient, like the voice of the forest itself, and it carried with it the weight of untold years. The question hung in the air, a challenge, a test. Jake felt a tremor run through him, his heart beating faster. This was the moment of truth. The darkness in the well had been a reflection of his fears, but now he had to face something else, something even more elusive, his own worth. He took a deep breath, his mind clearing, the pulse of the forest still strong beneath his skin. "I am ready," he said, his voice steady but filled with the conviction that had grown within him since this journey began. "We are ready." There was a long silence before the voice responded. "Very well. You seek the Guardian's bond, but first you must prove your strength. To bind yourself to the forest is to become one with it. You must offer a part of yourself, your heart, your soul, and prove that you will not falter when the time comes to stand against the darkness. Only then will the bond be forged." Jake felt the pull again, stronger this time, urging him deeper into the tree's essence. It was as though the tree itself was reaching out to him, pulling him into its ancient heart. He knew what it was asking, a sacrifice. The bond between a guardian and the forest was not one that could be taken lightly. It required trust, commitment, and the willingness to give up a part of yourself for something greater. Without hesitation, Jake closed his eyes again, focusing on the connection between him and the forest. "I will offer myself," he whispered, his words soft but firm. "I will stand for the forest, for the guardians, and I will not falter." The tree seemed to stir beneath his touch, its roots shifting deep within the earth. The pulse of the forest surged again, and this time Jake felt it, felt the ancient energy of the land flowing through him, entering him, merging with his very being. A sudden, sharp pain shot through him, a searing heat that seemed to burn from the inside out. He gasped, his hand trembling on the tree's bark, but he didn't pull away. This was the price. The bond was being forged, and it was not without its cost. The pain intensified for a moment, but then it began to ebb, the heat dissipating as quickly as it had come. In its place, a deep sense of peace washed over him. The connection had been made. The voice spoke again, this time with a note of approval. "You have proven your strength. The bond is forged." Jake opened his eyes, and before him, the tree seemed to glow with a soft, golden light. The air around them buzzed with energy, and in the light, a figure began to take shape. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by a hood. His cloak rippled with energy, his presence both comforting and powerful. The guardian of the forest. "I am Vale," the figure said, his voice resonating like the echo of thunder. "I am the guardian bound to this place. You have awakened me, and now I stand with you." Jake stepped back, his heart still racing from the bond that had been forged. The forest had given him its strength, its trust, and now Vale was here, one of the missing guardians ready to join the fight. "The others will follow," Vale continued, his gaze sweeping over them. "But the path ahead is not without peril. The darkness is closer than you think, and the time to act is now. We are bound to the forest, but it is the strength of the bond that will save us all." Jake nodded, his resolve strengthening. The forest had answered their call. Vale had joined them. And now the true journey could begin.